Howdy, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. And be sure to hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Hope you enjoy this.
Welcome to today's show. I'm going to be talking to Jimmy Akin, who is a Catholic. Well, I don't know if Catholic apologist is like your full-time job or something, but I'll let you introduce yourself. Okay, so yeah, you're a full-time Catholic apologist then. And what we're going to be talking about today are sort of reasons, I suppose, that I'm not not a Catholic, and I'm not like maybe a Christian in the sense that Jimmy would understand. You know, like I kind of go to church and stuff like that, but I guess I have a naturalized understanding of religion. So, you know, we're going to differ about some of those things. And I thank you for the super chat, by the way, John, who said submit to Rome. If people have questions in the chat, just put them throughout and I'll try to keep them for the end, or if there's an appropriate point in the conversation where it seems like, you know, we're talking about that topic or something, I'll try to stay on top of that. But otherwise, as we get started then, do you want to just kind of fill people in on your background then, Jimmy, who you are, how you became Catholic in the first place, maybe, as well?
Sure. Well, I don't know, to quote my personal brain care specialist, Gag Halfront, well, he's just this guy, you know? I guess, let's see, I'm a human being. I'm an American. I was born in Texas, but grew up in Arkansas. I now live in California. I was raised nominally Protestant. When I was young, my parents took us to a Church of Christ, which is a movement that's common in certain parts of America. It's a fundamentalist movement. And meaning they self-identify as fundamentalists. If you talk to a typical Church of Christ member, at least in the circles we ran in, they would say, yeah, I'm a fundamentalist. I don't use that term because for people who don't self-identify that way, because it's in other contexts an insult word, and I don't like to insult people. But when I was about 6 or 7, they stopped going to church, and after that, I was just raised nominally Protestant. We would go to church once or twice a year when we visited my grandparents. And I watched one of your videos, Nathan. By the way, thank you very much for having me on. Very nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise.
But I watched one of your videos where you were talking about how at assemblies in school, you would like sing hymns and hear parables read and explained and stuff. And that's actually more Christian education than I got, because in the American school system, unless you go to what we call a private school, private schools are often religious. But if you go to what we call a public school, which is a state-run school, we have no assemblies. Not of a religious nature. I mean, to us, an assembly is we're bringing together all the students for some outside speaker or something, and they're very rare. So actually, you know, I was probably raised more nominally Christian than you were. When I was in my teens, I became interested in the New Age movement, and I spent a while as a New Ager. I then broke with that and essentially became a deist. And then when I was 20, I had a conversion experience, and it proceeded in an interesting way. I had encountered a televangelist who was unlike any other televangelist in the world. His name was Dr. Gene Scott, and he.
I don't know of him, so I was thinking you were going to say maybe like Billy Graham or someone, and then
no. Gene. So at this point, I had a very intense negative reaction to the typical televangelists of the day. Not Billy Graham. He wasn't really on TV a lot, but Jerry Falwell, Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, these guys. And I had a negative reaction to ministers in general. And the stereotype I had of Christians was that they were a bunch of killjoys who just, you know, wanted to be moral scolds and kill other people's fun. And so I was you know, had a good deal of antipathy towards Christianity. But I was working at a restaurant as a dishwasher, and I would come home late at night after my shift. And this being the 1980s, there was nothing on TV. The internet did not exist. And so I had to content myself for my wind down period after work with watching whatever was on the air. And there was this guy, his name was Gene Scott. He would talk about God, but he was so unlike any of the other televangelists I had ever encountered. Number one, he would smoke on the air. You know, he would like have a cigar or a pipe and he would be smoking, and he would wear crazy hats, and he had a beard and would wear leather jackets and
this is starting to sound familiar. No,
well, no, but he would cuss, you know, and I mean, he would use cuss words, and yet he would talk about God. And so I came home and I found this guy on cable, and it's like, what is going on here? And so it got me to it got past the stereotypes of what Christian ministers were supposed to be. And it was arresting enough. It got me to sit down and listen for a while. And as a result of that, I started to think about different aspects of the Christian faith. And a friend of mine warned me and said, because I decided I was going to read the Gospels. I'd never read them all the way through. And I decided I was going to read the Gospels. And a friend of mine warned me and said, what happened to C.S. Lewis could happen to you. He was a smart guy. He wasn't a Christian, but then he started studying it and he became one. I said, oh, that's not going to happen. But I started reading the Gospels, and I started with Matthew, which is the first that you'll find in the order they're printed in a Bible. And I hated it. It was so unfamiliar. It was not like any kind of literature I was familiar with or used to reading. And then I read Mark, and I hated Mark even more because at least Matthew has little explanatory comments that Mark leaves out. And then by the time I got to Luke, it's like, okay, I'm starting to see how this kind of literature works. And so it was less unfamiliar to me now. I was starting to become familiar with the structure and the tropes and how the author is trying to communicate in this ancient writing style. And after I finished them, now these days, Matthew's one of my favorites. I love Matthew because now I understand how it works. But, and I've even written a commentary on Mark. But after I finished the Gospels, I said, okay, I think that there is, Christianity has something that is worth pursuing. And I didn't know what exactly that was. But I thought Christianity has a little something extra, so I'm going to be a Christian. Just kind of on this it has something extra that I don't think other religions I've encountered do. And so I was continuing in that mode. Looking back, I would say, okay, I was a very theologically liberal Christian at this point. I didn't have a lot of confidence in the supernatural, didn't have a lot of confidence in the Bible, but I just thought it had something extra. And then I read a book by a countryman of yours, F.F. Bruce. And it's just a little small book. It's called The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? And it was the first time I'd seen anybody present evidence for why the New Testament documents should be given credence, why we shouldn't just dismiss them as, oh, it's this ancient writing somebody wrote, but we don't really know anything about it. It shouldn't be considered reliable at all. And Bruce was not a fundamentalist. He was an evangelical Baptist from a British perspective. And he wasn't an inerrantist, I don't believe, but he did have a very high view of Scripture and would marshal historical evidence to say, okay, this is how we know about these documents. This is how we know who wrote, these epistles of Paul, and this is how the Gospels were constructed. And yes, they do contain reliable traditions about Jesus, and here's why it's reasonable to hold that. And that book was revolutionary for me. And so I started studying it intensely, and the whole Bible intensely. I read through the whole thing. I was later disappointed because I thought I'd read through the whole thing, and then it turns out there are these 7 deuterocanonical books that weren't in my Protestant Bible. I have to read those now. But I became very fascinated by the study of God's word, and I wanted to devote my life to it. So my plan was to become a Protestant minister or seminary professor. And really, seminary professor was what I was principally thinking, but I figured I could serve as a minister on the side. And then that all fell apart because I got married. And the woman I married was another former New Ager. Her name was Renee. Got a little picture of her in her wedding dress.
Yeah, I see.
There. Yeah. And those are her stuffed animals, by the way. But she was a former New Ager as well, but she also had a Catholic background. And when we got married, she was identifying as an Anglican because there was no way I, as a Protestant, was going to marry a Catholic, especially not if I had hopes of entering the ministry one day. And then after we got married and the pressure of losing me was off, she went back to Catholicism and wrecked my career. And, that was difficult, but I, wanting to serve God, I rolled with it. I went back to school. My training is in analytic philosophy, and so I went to grad school and continued to study philosophy, and I figured, well, I'll become a philosopher. But one thing that I'd always, and by the way, you had said, or before we got on the air, to kind of unspool about this a little so I could make this shorter, but I'm almost there.
Yeah, I'm fine. Like, I don't know all that much about your background other than from what I've listened to, a few kind of conversations and things you've had. So most of this is kind of new stuff for me as well. So it's all good.
But one of the things I'd done ever since becoming a Christian, or ever since my conversion at age 20, was I'd studied the theology of all different branches of Christianity, because I realized even though there's a million churches in my little town in the Ozarks, which church is within driving distance and which church has music I like or preaching I like is not a good test of theological truth. And so I didn't want to reflexively fall into a particular branch of Christianity and commit to it just because it was convenient for me. And so I made a point I would study Baptist theology, Pentecostal theology, Lutheran theology, Methodist theology, Catholic theology, Orthodox theology. I wanted to study everybody so that I could make an informed decision. And one of the things I had noticed when I read the Bible through for the first time was there were certain passages that just sounded Catholic to my Protestant ears, like when Jesus says, "This is my body and this is my blood." I was raised in a very Baptist area, and Baptists do not take that literally at all, but it sounds literal. And, Paul is saying that the Eucharist is a participation in the body of Christ, not just a symbol. Jesus also says to the disciples, "Whoever sins you forgive, they are forgiven. Whoever sins you retain, they are retained." That sounds like confession. Jesus says to Peter, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And I knew all these ways to try to argue that's not what it doesn't mean what it sounds like. But it sounds like Peter's the head of the church in Jesus's absence, and that would make Peter the first pope. Well, I decided when I first read the Bible, I'm a brand new Christian. I don't know a lot. I'm not going to make any decisions. I recognize these verses are Catholic sounding, but I'm just a baby Christian, so I'm going to put them on the shelf for now, and I'll come back to them when I know more and can make a more proper evaluation of them. And when I did that, I concluded that, well, they are Catholic sounding because that's the direction the New Testament points. It points towards the Catholic Church. There was a particular moment when I was reading a book, and it had an extended quotation from Matthew 16, which is the "You are Peter" passage. And even though I'd had all these arguments for why Peter is not the rock, I noticed as I was rereading the text from Matthew 16 that there are structural elements in the text that are so obvious, they're even obvious in English. If you think about them, you don't need to go to the Greek. Doing so helps, but they're obvious even in English that point towards Peter being the rock. And I said, okay, I've got to change my view on this. The other arguments I had are not as strong. These structural parallelisms are clear. Peter is the rock that Jesus is talking about, and that means he's head of the church when Jesus ascends to heaven, and that means he's the first pope. Now, whether there are later popes or whether this was kind of a one-time deal is a separate question. But it meant Catholics were right that Peter was the original earthly head of Jesus's church. And so what I needed to do was consider what else Catholics might be right about. And so I was in grad school at the time, and I took about a year to go through all the different categories of systematic theology, which I'd been studying, and revisit them with an open mind. And when I did that, I concluded that actually the biblical data supports the Catholic understanding of the Christian faith, and I needed to become a Catholic. And I got about 6 months into that process without realizing that opened up a new career possibility for me. Because I'd contented myself with saying, okay, I can't be a minister, I can't be a seminary professor, but I can be an analytic philosopher, and that's good. But then I realized after I'd already made the decision to become Catholic that I could become a Catholic apologist. I could devote my life to the study of God's word anyway, just through this other means. And I was so thankful in hindsight that happened, because that I didn't see it until I'd already made the decision that I knew I was becoming Catholic for the right reasons,
right?
Not
and
just because
not instrumentally because you could get something you wanted or something. Yeah,
exactly. And I was thankful that God hid that from me for that time. And so I was making preparations to be received into the Catholic Church. And then my wife died. She came down with colon cancer. It was an extremely aggressive form. Her oncologist thought she only had it for a few months. And from the time we detected the first symptom, which we didn't even know what it was, she had health issues, including ulcerative colitis. And one day she had a pain in her abdomen. We thought it was just an ulcerative colitis flare-up. 7 weeks later, she was dead. And I was actually received into the Catholic Church in her hospital room 2 days before she died, using the emergency shortened form of the rites. And that's how I became a Catholic, and I have been ever since. I later came out to California and auditioned for a job at Catholic Answers, which is the ministry I work for, and I'm now in my 30th year at Catholic Answers. My 30th anniversary as a professional apologist will be next June. By another divine coincidence, my report to work date is June 1st, which is the feast of Saint Justin Martyr, the patron saint of apologists. Had no idea that was the case when I got the job, but I've viewed that as another kind of divine wink or nod or blessing that I'm thankful for. I also have lots of other interests. I'm a sci-fi fan. I'm a comic book fan. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a comic book writer artist, so I do comic book style illustration. I worked as a private detective for a while, so I've arrested people, and it can be intense when you're arresting someone because you don't know what weapons they may be carrying. I also am a dance instructor. I call multiple forms of dance, including square dance, contra dance, a little bit of line dancing, but a couple that may be more familiar to you, English country dancing.
Honestly, I don't know that. I only know, I know Morris dancing. But
I also do Morris dancing. So, right. So I have that as a social life, and although not so much during COVID, and I'm a podcaster. So I appear on multiple podcasts. Obviously, I'm on Catholic Answers podcast, which is called Catholic Answers Live, but I'm also on some other podcasts. Two of them are sci-fi review shows. One of them is Secrets of Doctor Who, and the other is Secrets of Star Trek. But what I'm most famous for is a podcast I do called Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. And on Mysterious World, we look at mysteries. They can be natural mysteries. They can be supernatural mysteries. They may involve history or science or the paranormal or religion. And every Friday we look at a mystery, and we look at it through the twin perspectives of faith and reason. And we try to be very open-minded. We try to consider multiple perspectives on each mystery. And then we try to use reason to solve the mystery to the extent that's possible. So we don't, unlike a lot of mystery shows, just try to generate, just imagine, what if this were true, and leave it there. We try to figure out what is true to the extent we can. And so, like with the current UFO UAP phenomenon, in my assessment, other people's assessments may be different, but in my assessment, I think that there's enough evidence that it shouldn't just be dismissed. Something is going on that has potential defense implications. And I think if you have unknown aerial things, in whatever they are, whether they're human or whether they're from, they might be from China or wherever, but if you've got unknown things in your military's airspace interfering with military operations, you need to study that. And so I would say, I don't know what UFOs or UAPs are. I don't know if they're alien. I don't know if they're a secret government project. I don't know if they're misidentified conventional phenomena. But if they're messing in our military's airspace during military operations, we need to study that. And so I think that's a good thing.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I didn't know about your wife as well, and that was really tragic to hear. So, yeah, I'm sorry that that's part of your story.
Well, it was very painful. It was also, 30 years ago now, and time heals, fortunately. So, for anyone who experiences a tragedy, it's okay to grieve and it's okay to feel pain, but it will get better. You won't have to feel like that always.
So, I guess part of the reason I wanted to invite you on is because I like your approach to apologetics in general, insofar as I'm pretty critical of apologetics, right? Because I can see,
too.
Yeah, well, and that's partly what I liked about your approach, because when I saw you pointing out a lot of these problems, for example, with William Lane Craig's approach and the Kalam, and I was like, hang on, this is interesting, and then I looked a bit more into the way that you talk about these things, and obviously I disagree with you, but it's it doesn't feel as much about it can feel like salesmanship, or it can feel very very much like combative, sometimes, and that seems kind of contrary to the things that I find important about true religion, and also like my inquiry in the philosophy space as well, where I don't want it to be combative. So I sort of enjoyed discovering you, because you had a different point of view, and I sort of wanted to have a conversation about these things. And I think you've gone and looked at like my story a little bit. So like my conversion video, which I've still got up, which I kind of find a little bit cringy and embarrassing now, but and then some things about like my deconversion and what caused it, and then maybe my journey since, and where I sit now, and how I view religion, how I think about metaphysics and the world, and so on. So I wondered first if you just wanted to share your initial thoughts about what you thought about my story, kind of going away and watching these things and seeing all those changes.
Well, it seems to me you're a sincere, thoughtful guy, and you've had, everybody has some difficulties in life. You've certainly had yours, and I think it's great that you've been open to the Christian faith, and you've gone through different phases in that. And I understand that. I mean, early on, I went through phases too. My earliest experience of Christianity post my conversion at age 20, in some ways was a lot like yours. And I had ups and downs too. And eventually, as I learned more, I came to the place I am. But, you seem to me to be a sincere, thoughtful guy who's genuinely searching. And I'm happy to be of whatever assistance I can. So I was happy to come on.
I wondered, in terms of listening to me kind of talk about these things, what would you say, like, the major kind of things that you disagree on? Because I mean, obviously, the claim of whether like God exists in this metaphysically real sense, I'm kind of like, I guess I kind of withhold assent about that. Like, I call myself epistemically agnostic, just because that I find it a really difficult question to engage with, and I see that there's so much said about it by both sides that I just find it very difficult for me to make my mind up. And that's not to say that other people, can't be rational in their belief or whatever, but just for me, I don't think it's rational for me to assent either way. I don't know. Feel free to come in at that point if that's.
Well, it's not so much a disagreement. I mean, obviously, I think God is metaphysically real. But what struck me in looking at your material is, even though we have some similar background and similar approaches, a difference in approach is I tend to be much more cognitively focused or take a more cognitive trajectory towards approaching the faith. And it seems like you take a more experiential trajectory. And both of those are fine. I think they're legitimate. I think both a cognitive approach and an experiential approach, those are both legitimate ways to come at the faith. And so I don't disagree with that approach. It just happens to be not the one that I tend to take. In thinking about what you might want to talk about, and it's your show. It's, I'm here to be of whatever service I can. So I'll be guided by you in terms of the specific things you'd like to talk about. But I thought, well, certainly there are cognitive arguments for Christianity, and then there are non-cognitive arguments. And if you're someone for whom the experiential aspect of things is what sings, then, I'm happy to talk about non-cognitive approaches as well.
I think talking about the cognitive stuff could be useful. I mean, in terms of the non-cognitive stuff, I agree that I think that is... cognitively, right, I see it like being a real kind of clincher, in the sense that I think Christians can be rational, I think atheists can be rational, and I really like a holistic approach that kind of, looks at the strongest theory on the one side, the strongest kind of like grand explanatory theory of everything on the one side and the other side, and kind of compares them. And I sort of find myself having more questions for what I see as being like the Christian kind of model of reality than I do for kind of the naturalist one cognitively. But then I think for me, what I see as kind of evidence the other way is the experience of like reading the Bible devotionally, or of trying to model one's life after Jesus, of engaging in Christian community and stuff like that. So those things, I mean, those things appeal to me and carry some evidential weight. But I definitely, I think something that I struggle with in terms of assent is like I just have all these issues in, well, if I'm making some claim about when I participate in this stuff, not just that it's useful for me or it helps me be a better person or it's like a good way to live or something, and I'm like, no, like that there's some real metaphysics at work here or something that then I just have problems with that. So maybe maybe talking about the cognitive stuff could be useful. I don't know. I'm guessing. Do you think it would be useful to kind of talk about the classical like kind of arguments from natural theology? And do you want to talk about what you see those as doing as well? Like, what do you see the role of natural theology as being, maybe, before we talk about some of those?
Well, I think that there's a whole bunch of different ways we could go. I think that that natural theology is a legitimate approach. I think it's a fruitful approach. I think that it is one that is even endorsed in the New Testament itself, because, for example, in Romans, St. Paul talks about how there are certain basic things about God that can be known without special revelation, including his existence and his power and things like that, because he has a sort of natural approach or natural theology approach to learning about God that in some ways is similar to what Plato or Aristotle would do, and Paul endorses that view. In terms of the foundations of natural theology. So I think it's possible to prove the existence of God with certitude if you're using the right premises. If you're not using the right premises, then of course your proof's not going to work. And the trick is figuring out what are the right premises. Because of the state in which we find ourselves, which classical Christianity would describe as a fallen state, there are impediments to the pristine ideal use of reason, and that can make it difficult to reason about things, not just God, but lots of other things. One of my favorite pieces from the satire newspaper The Onion was from a few years ago, when The Onion ran a story about a new finding that scientists had, which they were announcing, which is that science is hard. And I'm a big science fan. I read science news every day, and it's even in science, there's all kinds of different theories, many of which are not going to be well supported, and are going to be overturned with further research. But it's just tricky when you're trying to get to the foundations of a subject, whether it's science or philosophy or religion. We get into some deep waters that our intellects are not used to playing in naturally. And so I'm convinced that there's truth in all of these areas, but getting at it can be very tricky. So I guess that's what I would have to say about the role of natural theology in general terms.
In terms of, like the purpose of these arguments, I suppose, in presenting one to someone like me, who's like, I'm at least, you could psychologize and maybe say I'm not or something, but I at least saying, I want to be on board and follow it through to the best of my lights of reason can. But do you think then the idea of the argument is that it makes it like rationally permissible to believe the conclusion or something like that, or that it should compel any reflective, reasonable person who kind of hears it to that conclusion?
Well, I think it can do both. I think if one is operating with the right premises, then it will arguments for God's existence that are successful will both make it rational to believe and also will provide positive reason to believe, and that an ideal reasoner would recognize that and say, okay, well, yeah, then God must exist. Let me ask you a question, though, because it'll help me understand better how I can be of service. So you say you feel that you can't accept these. Now, is it simply because you perceive flaws in all of the arguments you've encountered so far, or is there something of a personal disposition that prevents you from accepting arguments? Like maybe some of them you see, there's some plausibility to that argument, but I find on a personal level held back from being able to accept it. Like maybe, for example, I'll speak to my own experience. There are times where I'll think about something and I'll say, okay, I like this conclusion and I like this argument that leads to this conclusion, but I'm afraid to embrace the conclusion because what if I'm wrong? Like, what if I'm factually mistaken about this, and I've used an inadequate argument to get to that conclusion? Then somehow I'm doing something like morally wrong. I shouldn't use, if this argument isn't conclusive, I shouldn't use it because that's somehow shady. Is that a concern? I know I have felt that. Is that something that you experience, or is it something else that you say keeps you from holding back?
I think there's something a little bit like what you're describing there. I had thought you might have meant something else by it, but in terms of what you're describing there, I think what it is for me is it's that these arguments sort of don't exist in a vacuum, as it were, and so if someone gives you some premises and a conclusion, it's a valid argument, right? You've just got kind of a consistent set of claims where if you negate the conclusion, then it's inconsistent. And it's like, so when it comes to me evaluating that argument, I sort of want to think, well, how does that look with everything else I believe? Like, what are the other entailments from this set of claims? And then it just becomes, it becomes a much larger project, like very quickly, than just than just evaluating the two premises, because you've got to think, what are all the entailments from these things, or what, how do they combine with other things that I believe to entail different things, and how, and then I start thinking, how does that look together as a theory, and So yeah, I think something about the. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So in that regard, what other entailments are of concern here? Because I understand this argument. It's a coherence based, approach of, well, if I accept this, it's going to ripple out into the web of belief in these ways, and it's going to dislodge other things, I think. And so it's not just this one issue that matters. It's all of the implications. It's kind of, I'm going to have to drag this big net to shift my belief system in these ways. What are some of the other commitments that you have that make it difficult to accept the idea of God's existence in a metaphysically real way?
Yeah. I think one of them for me is going to be the kind of nature of mental activity, right? And which I think is physical, like identical to certain brain states, I would say. And another one is going to be like the causal closure of the physical universe as well, which means that I kind of have problems understanding lots of kind of aspects of theistic hypotheses and how they work. Another one is going to be simplicity and bruteness. So I think that there is a fair amount of kind of bruteness in a naturalist hypothesis of reality, in terms of just saying, well, that's just how it is, kind of, for a lot of things. But I've kind of come to find that when I compare these to theistic hypotheses, that they have like a further layer of explanation, but then the explanation itself is kind of a repackaging of each of those things that's to be described, but in terms of like an act of free will or something. So then you kind of have, it's relatively ad hoc, because then when you ask like, well, why is this physical constant this value rather than that? You say like, because God had a desire to set it this rather than that, and he did this rather than that. And it's the same in each case. And then you've got like a brute contingency for that, like libertarian free will, if you want to call it, an action or an event, however you want to kind of frame that thing actually happening. And I guess I just struggle with a lot of these things because I don't understand how they could work, and I've wrestled with this question, because I thought, when I'm asking how it could work, what am I asking there? Am I saying, I want you to kind of give me a mechanism or something, but then the hypothesis isn't of like a physical mechanism. So of course it's not going to be, even if it's true, it's not going to be describable in terms of that. But I certainly struggle with the theory itself, just because it seems excessive to me. And then, I mean, maybe more specifically, and tell me if you want me to pause and talk about any of these things independently.
I'll come back to some of them.
Okay. There's also questions about classical theism. So, I'm a big fan of apophatic theology in Christianity because of the kind of, I like the mysticism and stuff. But I do struggle with the notion of only being able to describe God's nature analogically, because I don't know how we could know that we're actually, when we correctly use an analogy, as it were, or when we incorrectly use an analogy, those seem like difficulties. Also problems with, classical theism specifically, which I think Catholics are committed to, the idea of how God can be related to anything sort of doesn't make sense to me. Also, the idea of because the theistic hypothesis says that there's a sort of state where God exists sans time, and that's perfect. I really struggle with the notion of change from that state to get anything else, for things to begin to exist or anything like that. I struggle with the idea of somehow imperfection coming from that as well. Now, this isn't a claim about it being like logically incompatible or anything. I've not really formulated, but I struggle to understand like why that would, like why God would have reasons to create, and then we can talk about, you know, like certain kind of goods that are in the world that God would want to make. But this seems to be in tension with the idea of this God being kind of like self-sufficient and perfect and and so that's a kind of tension, I guess, that I have. And there's probably a few other, but those are broadly like my concerns, and I think that a lot of those concerns are just not present in kind of like a naturalist model of reality, which is just very similar, but doesn't kind of say that, you know, God created and set certain these values and things. I mean, there's stuff we could talk about in terms of like why, you know, why I don't think things like except certain arguments like fine-tuning or whatever, but those are my broad concerns, is like the theory comparison, and I just see these problems in the theistic kind of theory.
That's very helpful, thank you. When you say you use the term naturalistic to refer to the alternative worldview that you find attractive, that can mean a few different things. Do you mean materialistic? Conventional matter and energy is everything.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, I'm not like a physicist, so there are some aspects of physics that would help me to understand, you know, what I'm kind of claiming here a bit better. But broadly, yeah, it's the kind of, you know, that reality is kind of causally closed, and comprised entirely of these kind of physical causes. Maybe physicalism or something would be better. And those things are what like the physical sciences study.
Okay. So one of the things that occurs to me is that I understand the cognitive tensions that you have in this regard, and to some extent I share them, because I'm not a professional scientist, but I study. I mean, I read science books for fun. So I am very familiar with the contours of this worldview, and I understand its appeal to people. But one of the things that occurs to me is that science has proceeded piecemeal. I mean, we've always had a version of science, and that it wasn't always called that. It used to be called, for example, for a long time, natural philosophy, but it's proceeded piecemeal down through the centuries, and scientists or natural philosophers have done their best to come to grips with phenomena and interpret them largely, at least initially, as they see them. And I think this is a good premise. I think that we have to interpret phenomena as they appear as a starting point, and then use that to have a more refined understanding of them. We can't systematically distrust our sensory input, otherwise we're in a Cartesian pit that we can never effectively climb out of, no matter how much Descartes tried to climb out of it. And so I think it's legitimate to say, well, I understand so much of this phenomenon, and then there are things beyond that I don't know how they fit together. And that's okay. So, for example, you mentioned constants of nature. One of the constants of nature is known as the fine structure constant, or it's also known as alpha, and it's approximately 1/137th. It's a dimensionless constant, so it doesn't involve any measurements or any specific units of measurement. And it deals with electromagnetic phenomena, and so the color of your wall appears to be the color you see, in part because of alpha. Alpha also deals with nuclear decay rates, and we don't know why alpha is 1/137. That's its approximate value. Richard Feynman said, this number just comes out of nowhere. In fact, he even said it's kind of like God wrote it. But he said, we don't, as scientists, know where this number comes from, and everyone ought to put this number up on their wall and worry about it. And it seems to me that there may be an analogy to some of your experience, in that you're saying, well, I find this theistic hypothesis attractive, but it can't explain, or I haven't seen convincing explanations for some of the follow-on questions. And you mentioned in that regard specifically constants, natural constants, like why is this constant this way? Well, because God said it this way. And, actually theists can go a little bit further with these and say, actually, God wanted to create, we don't know why exactly, but God chose to create us. And this constant is required to have approximately this value in this kind of universe in order for us to exist. And so they are providing explanations for why the constant is the way it is. It raises deeper issues like, well, then why would God want to create us? And on classical theism, and certainly on the Catholic understanding of classical theism, he didn't have to. There's no inner compulsion in God that requires him to create us. And since he's infinite and all perfect, he doesn't need us. And so kind of the best we can do is say, well, he is loving, and he wanted or chose to create us, as and we reflect his glory and his creative ability, and he can relate to us and have loving relationships with us. He didn't need those things, but that's the general picture that emerges on this understanding of theism. And yeah, there are limits to what we can say. There is mystery here. However, the same thing is true on the scientific side. As Feynman is saying, okay, you put alpha up on your wall and worry about it, because we have no theory that accounts for why it has the value it does. It just comes out of nowhere. And it seems to me that, number one, that whether one takes a religious approach or a scientific approach, we are encountering the same phenomenon of we know so much, but we hit a wall at some point in terms of what we can explain. And at best, beyond that wall, we have guesses, but not proofs. So it seems to me that this difficulty is encountered, whether one is a theist or a non-theist. You hit the same phenomenon, the limits of our knowledge and the desire to know more, and to know more about how things fit together than we know. It also seems to me, although this is a secondary point, that on the theistic approach, we actually seem to get a bit further. I mean, we don't have proof of, well, okay, so God created us as loving, as rational beings he could have loving relationships with, but at least one can sketch a theory there, even if it extrapolates beyond the data that we have confidence of from a scientific perspective. It does provide a more developed understanding of here's what we think could be going on. And it's certainly equally legitimate as, oh, well, the constant is this way, alpha is this way in our universe because there's a multiverse with, and by the way, I love the idea of the multiverse. I hope it's real. But scientifically speaking, there's this multiverse of an infinite number of universes, or at least a very large number of universes that we have no scientific proof for. And in each one of them, the constants are a little bit different, and we happen to come up on the jackpot universe on the cosmic slot machine to allow life. Okay, that's a story that explains it as well. It's a less loving and hopeful story, but it's a story that explains it as well. But both go beyond the scientific data we have. And so it seems to me that both the theistic approach and a non-theistic approach are kind of at epistemic parity on this. So I don't know if that's useful, but it occurs to me that that's something that that might be useful as you continue to discern all this, that there may be more epistemic parity between the theistic and non-theistic positions than may first appear.
Yeah, I definitely, just to say on that last point, I definitely would agree with you that both what I see the theist and the naturalist as doing is like constructing metaphysical theories. Like, so, I'm not a fan of, when people will kind of just appeal to science and say, we just need to let the I mean, I think science has to inform these theories, right? But I agree that both sides when they construct these like grand explanatory worldviews, they're going beyond what the science says to kind of try and explain things or kind of see how they hang together.
Yeah, they're metaphysical rather than physical theories.
Right. And yeah, so the first point you raised about something like a principle of credulity or phenomenal conservatism, I think I agree with that broadly as well. I do have some, sometimes I'll I'm a bit skeptical of its use in some applications, because I think that sometimes perception is kind of quite theory laden, and sometimes people will provide, highly kind of ramified seeming. So what I mean by that is they'll say that there's something that just seems to them some way, but there's just a ton of so maybe certain things, when people kind of report their seemings, it's like, yeah, they're absent any defeater. But if someone's like, I look at this leaf and I can just see that it's intelligently designed or something, and that's their seeming, it's like, well, there's a lot that goes into that. There are
counter arguments to that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And there's more that could be said, but broadly, I'm going to be on board with that, the phenomenal conservatism. But yeah, I think the main concern that, or the main kind of argument that it seemed like you were talking about there is something close to the fine tuning argument, saying like, well, it's kind of weird, right, that all of these constants are like at this value rather than that value. And further, the values that they're at are life permitting. So it seems like we've got this like massive possibility space of just the ways things could have been, but only one of them, very specifically, is life permitting. I think actually, for me, the reason I don't find the fine tuning argument compelling is because I think it's actually in conflict with the theistic hypothesis. Because so I think the fine tuning is an interesting question if you think that
and I should say, fine tuning is not my favorite argument for God's existence. I think it has utility. I mentioned it in this context because of the constants came up, but you were saying
it's okay. I sort of tend to think, for me, and I am making the claim that the like mind-brain supervenience or like physical supervenience is metaphysically necessary, right? So for someone who makes that claim, I think that fine-tuning does raise like a problem. So it kind of does raise a problem for me. But the problem is, but the problem that it raises, I think, is going to be in tension with the theistic hypothesis, where they're going to postulate a non-mental mind. Because the question that we're trying to answer is
theists postulate a non-mental mind.
Sorry, a non-physical mind.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's if I said non-mental mind, I'm messing up my sentences. So
we all do that. There studies show an average of about one for a normal person, and speech error of about one word every 1,000.
Okay, I didn't know that. So yeah, part of the reason that I think this, right, is that the idea behind fine tuning is that there are certain psychophysical laws that hold, and you can kind of if you modify the physical constants, well, then you're not going to get conditions in which entities like us can exist with our kind of moral lives and our mental and moral lives, right? But if you don't believe that supervenience relation is necessary, which I don't think the theist does, because I think that theists can say, God could have had no physical reality at all and just souls, or he could have done like any of these other ways. Well, then all of a sudden, fine tuning isn't actually evidence that we'd have to update on if that's the case, if it's not necessary that we have that mind brain supervenience. And the reason is because it sort of it could have been any other way, right? It's not fine tuned in the sense that we have to, that the person who believes the psychophysical laws could have been these other ways has to then account for why the physical constants permit life, because it could have been given theism. Yeah, it could have been that God could have just created like souls or something on their own, and the physical constants could have been anything, right? And
in fact, classical theism would say that he did. I mean, that it's commonly understood. It's not certain, but it's commonly understood or commonly thought that the angels preceded us. And so at one point we did have ghost world or spirit world. And then God chose to supplement that with the physical world. And so you're right. I would say you're absolutely right. God could have created intelligent and did create intelligent beings that lacked physicality. I would say that frames the fine-tuning question in an interesting way, but it remains true that, well, he also, if God exists, he also chose to create us, and we are mixed physical spiritual beings. And in our case, since physicality is part of our nature, he did need to create some kind of universe that we could exist in. And it's part of this would fall out of the great chain of being hypothesis. So, even though God didn't have to create anything, he chose to create this spectrum of things that, like, angels, they're created intellects that are superior to humans. Then you've got mixed spiritual physical beings like us and animals, and plants. Those on classical theism have souls that keep their bodies alive too. And then completely material things that have no souls, and maybe other things below that. But if he chooses to create the chain of being, then there need to be spaces for all the other different kinds of creatures to exist in. So I would agree with you that fine-tuning is not necessary on the theistic hypothesis, but it seems to me that if you have the one given of God wanted to create at least beings like us, then he needed to prepare a space in which such beings could exist. And that's what we see. It looks, given the conceptual space of all the other ways we can imagine the laws of nature, it looks like either we're in a design space, or we are in a space that just happened to come up jackpot on the cosmic slot machine. So, yeah. Or you've got to propose there are loads of other slot machines out there that all have different values, and Occam, Mr. Occam is going to have a little difficulty with that.
So yeah, in terms of you kind of painting the more Aristotelian picture or Thomistic picture of that. Mm-hmm. So you're saying by us, what you mean is like
humans.
That we have these natures that inhere in physical bodies. Mm-hmm. Is that that's what you're saying? So you're saying like that's what I mean by we. That's
we are mixed spiritual physical beings. We have both a spiritual element that transcends matter and is immaterial, and also a material element, and by our nature we have both.
And was the idea that we need a physical world like ours
to have our bodies?
Okay. But I guess the idea behind the objection that I'm putting forward is like, people say, well, it's really expected, given theism, right, that it'd be fine-tuned in this way. But I think the objection is running something like, well, God could have done it some other way. So without our bodies, we could have had just as moral, mental lives or something. Or there could be, like individually...
Like angels.
Yeah, individually conscious electrons or something that just exist, and they have their own little love stories and so forth, sort of thing. And that's a morally valuable world in a sense of what.
Actually, electrons are very antisocial. They're all negatively charged, and they repel each other.
And so the problem is, are you saying that doesn't kind of lower the expectedness given theism? Are you saying like you don't think that those are genuine possibilities? Or are you saying they are?
What like would not be a genuine possibility?
Like the psychophysical laws being different given theism, like God creating a world where there's just like electrons in love, and that's kind of like a valuable state of affairs or something.
Well, so it depends. It depends on. I can take that in a couple different ways. On the one hand, the question is a little bit like, could God make water something other than H2O? And my inclination is to say H2O is just the essence of water. So God could make something that looks and acts like water that's not H2O, but it wouldn't be water in that case. I think at least how how I would tend to approach it would be to say, in the case of water, we've correctly identified its physical essence. And so if we've correctly identified the physical essence of electrons, no, they can't actually have love. But we may not have correctly identified the essence of electrons. So so could God have electrons fall in love with each other? Maybe. Or he could have spirits supervene over them, and the spirits could love each other, regardless of the fact their physical bodies as electrons repel each other. It's like, sorry, honey, I just find you repulsive. So I can take it in different ways. I think
this helps me understand. So you are actually saying then, I think that in order to have persons like us, right, we do supervene on like the physical stuff that is the way it is. Like that, it has to be that way. That's of metaphysical necessity, right?
In order to be a human, yes. You have to have, in order to be a complete human. I mean, this is standard Thomistic position, and I'm not a Thomist, by the way, but it is. I agree with Thomas on this, that in order to have a complete human being, you need to have a spirit that supervenes on a body, or that animates a body. And if you have just the spirit, well, you've got a part of a human. And if you've got just the body, well, you've got part of a human, but you need to have both if it's going to be a complete human. And this kind of gets us in the direction of something I wanted to go back to, which is a materialist theory or physicalist theory of mind, because you indicated that that's something that that you feel fairly strongly about. I understand the appeal of that, given the ability to induce changes in thought by inducing changes in the brain. But we've known that for forever. I mean, people have been getting drunk since the Stone Age. And so it's been obvious this entire time you introduce certain physical changes, like certain substances, into the body, and it's going to alter mental function. And yet, the idea that there is a difference between mind and matter is a human universal. It is in every culture in world history. It doesn't matter what one you go to, everybody has this distinction. And as a result, based on phenomenal conservatism, I would say we need to take that seriously. Now, you can argue, okay, maybe this distinction disintegrates on close examination, and that's a legitimate argument to make. But I think actually reviewing the data on this, it doesn't. The idea of physicalism for mental states is an assumption that actually is not scientifically supportable. And there is a lot more data on this than most people realize, including me, until fairly recently. Because recently I've begun to study, expanded my study of parapsychology, and there's a lot better data in parapsychology for the existence of phenomena that cannot readily be explained on a physicalist understanding of mental phenomena than one might suppose. And so, I mean, I can make that statement. I can't read you a set of papers at the moment, but there is actual considerable parapsychological evidence that there is more than just that we need to adopt more than just a physicalist understanding of mind. In fact, one of the ideas that I find intriguing, I haven't had a chance to study it thoroughly yet, is that, but it is kind of a Copernican revolution to think this way, but what if the brain isn't a generator? What if it's a transducer? And the job of the central nervous system is to transduce what's happening on the spiritual level onto the physical level, in which case, if you mess with the physical transducer, it's going to affect the output. Just like if I have a television set or a radio and I break it, it's going to function wrong. And so if you introduce a railroad spike into someone's head, so his transducer is busted, well, that's going to affect his mental function because it's not transducing properly. So it's the point I guess I'm making is that there are additional ways to look at this, and there is some scientific evidence for beyond the purely material.
My sort of view of the mind, at least currently, is that certain physical states just are identical to certain mental states. And so, I mean, I'm not like a... Well, so something like whatever state my brain is in right now, like just is identical to like the kind of conscious state that I've got. So that
can you be specific?
Specifically, so like, you know, nervous system activity in the V4 dorsal region is like visual activity or something like that. I would say something like that.
Okay.
You know, that's obviously an oversimplification.
That's fine. And so you would say, and that every mental phenomenon you experience is produced by and exclusively by something going on in your wetware, correct?
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. How do you know that?
I think I hold the position for a few reasons. Some of them you mentioned, the sort of, you know, I think the correlations and things are some evidence, or at least what they help to do is excise like some theories, and they give us something to work with. Like, this is data to be explained. But then I think it's kind of similar to the way that I look at the theism case, where I like, well, we've just got to build up like a theory of what's going on here. And I kind of compare that theory to, you know, like dualism of various kinds, like property dualisms or substance dualisms. I compare it to like panpsychism and others, functionalism, say. And I sort of then go, well, how do these theories compare according to their theoretical virtues? And I just think that the physicalist one kind of wins out. And that's how I go about.
Okay.
I mean, I wouldn't say I know it, but I have like a fairly high confidence as well.
Okay. And I know there are reasons that people propose this. My view is that it does involve, I guess there are 2 points. Number one, it isn't, with 3 points. Number one, it isn't proven. Number two, it involves a good bit of assumption. There's a cognitive leap that's being made between what the data actually shows and the conclusion that's being drawn from it. And so I think there's this cognitive gap that's there with this theory, as with others, but certainly with this theory. And then thirdly, I think there's counter evidence that is not being taken into account properly. So I understand, you know, this is your position and you have reasons for it. I invite you to contemplate the 3 things that I mentioned, and would be happy to provide supporting documentation if desired.
I do agree that the position goes beyond the empirical data, but I think this is it's kind of similar to like considering the fine-tuning argument, where it's like all, you know, any metaphysical theory of mind is going to go beyond the empirical data. You know, they're all kind of trying to do that. So yeah. In terms of like the consensus gentium, I do agree with. So you gave an argument from, you know, most people kind of don't believe that the mind is physical. So that's kind of like evident. That's kind of evidence against the position or something.
All people, all cultures have the idea that the mind is distinct from the body, and that's a human universal. And so, yeah, I would say that's prima facie evidence that the mind is not the same thing. That physical phenomena are not the same thing as mental phenomena. They may be correlated. They may even, in some situations, be biconditional, but they are nevertheless distinct. And
I agree that, you know, like that kind of rests on something like the principle of credulity or something, you know, to say, well, and we should kind of trust, you know, what they're telling us, like absent any defeaters or something, or we should trust their seemings absent any defeaters. And like I say, I do agree with that, but I think I do have defeaters in when it comes to us doing this theory comparison. You know,
cool. What are they?
So what some of them would be, for example, like the idea of downward causation and how that fits in with how that fits in with the causal closure of the physical universe. Now, like, someone could obviously reject the causal closure of the physical universe, but then I kind of want to understand how that fits in with the rest of physics. You know, like that. This is quite an important node in the holistic like system of my beliefs, for example.
Okay.
And another one would just be the
okay. So let's look at that for just a second. So when you say the causal closure of the universe, you mean the physical universe.
Yeah, physical causal closure. Yeah.
Right. Because if it's true that there are mental phenomena that are non-physical in nature and that they interact with the universe and can cause things to happen in the universe, we're talking about a bigger universe. Because it's not just the physical phenomena we see, it includes all these other things too. And so if we then have evidence for the existence of mental phenomena that function independently of physical phenomena, whether it's the human spirit or angels or God, then there is this question of, okay, so how do these two systems relate to each other? And that's something that we've seen before in science, how does and we have partial understandings of some of it. I mean, we now, for example, we don't believe in phlogiston anymore, but we needed a way to explain how do things get hot, what causes that. And, now we have the kinetic theory of heat. And so that's good. We have a better understanding there. Where we have a less good understanding is gravity. We know how gravity works to a great degree of approximation. We can send space probes to very precise locations based on Newton's equations as modified by Einstein. But when it comes to what is gravity, we're in basically the same position that Isaac Newton was. You can kind of say maybe it's curvature of space-time. Maybe it's a field that's mediated by particles called gravitons. We really don't. Maybe it's something else. We really don't know. When Newton introduced the theory of gravity, he was violating Aristotelian physics in that he was proposing action at a distance, which was a classical no-no in Aristotelian physics. If you want one object to exert an influence on another object, that effect has to be transmitted by a physical medium. And Newton was saying, no, we really do have action at a distance. And he was thereby accused of introducing a concept from natural magic into science. Natural magic is, as the term was used, is unknown occult principles embedded in nature. And so Newton was accused of introducing this literally spooky natural magical notion into physics. And people were initially very suspicious of it because it was just an effect with no causal explanation. But his equations worked so well, people eventually got used to it and kind of forgot about, oh, this is spooky action at a distance. And so that's an instance where we can describe the phenomenon, but we really don't have a theoretical understanding of it. And I think we're in a similar situation when it comes to gravity, when it comes to the causal closure of the overall universe, including both non-material and material entities. I think we do have evidence for non-material effects on matter. And the term that's applied in parapsychology for that is psychokinesis. And there can be different forms of psychokinesis. There are different theories about how psychokinesis works, but fundamentally, whether it's a human, if I choose to move my arm as a voluntary act, I would say, well, something's going on in my spirit, which is transduced through my brain into my central nervous system that is causing this to happen. But that first initial connection is psychokinetic. And if an angel does something that has an effect in the physical world, that's psychokinetic. If God does something in the physical world, like create it, that's psychokinetic. That's definitely mind over matter. And so what we really are looking at in this area then would be, well, if we have evidence for these non-physical things that influence the physical world, then we need to look more closely at psychokinesis, as that's a conceptual tool that we can use to investigate the phenomena in more detail and try to figure out how it works. But I've been on a little bit of a soapbox there for a moment, so hand it back over to you.
Yeah, like in terms of some of the things you're saying, I agree that the we can talk about the psi phenomena stuff in a moment, but I agree with what you're saying that someone could revise causal closure, right, or something. So they could say, like, as I think this is the direction you were going when you were like, okay, your theory says that there's kind of this box of physical stuff, but maybe there's like, according to my theory, there's this box of physical stuff, and then there's this box of like other stuff, and maybe, energy doesn't have to be conserved in that box because there's this kind of outer box, and there's, that maybe there's different laws and things. And I think the point that I would want to make is just that I agree that's like a candidate.
It's kind of like Earth is a planet that's fairly isolated from other planets, and so it largely is functioning as an independent system, but then occasionally a meteor comes down and another system interacts with it.
And I'd agree, like, I think both are candidate hypotheses, right? And I'd say both are empirically adequate in as, like, I'd say substance, I don't object to substance dualism. I think I object to it on the basis of it just not being as good a theory as physicalism. Obviously, you're not defending substance dualism, but I don't kind of look for these knockdown deductive arguments or something. I say, like, both theories are empirically adequate, but I kind of just don't need to postulate like all these rules about interaction and so forth, and kind of revise maybe my broader view of physics as well. But both views, I agree, can be rendered empirically adequate. And I'd say, though, so then what we do is we just look at kind of like the commitments and things that our theories involve, and I say that physicalism wins there. But this thing that you were saying, though, about like psi phenomena, I agree that so what we want our theory to do, right, is fit all the data, explain as much as possible while minimizing commitments. And I agree that if there are truly such phenomena, then maybe that's going to be a problem for the physicalist explanation here, right? Because that might lie outside of what my kind of theory predicts or something. So it's evidence in favor of some different theory. And yeah, I mean, I've not looked into loads of this stuff, but I have, like, I looked into a lot of the out of body experience and near death experience things, for example. And I haven't been particularly impressed by any of the examples I've looked at least, where it seems to me that in a lot of these cases, there's kind of either memory contamination and biases and socialization taking places after the fact in like the retelling of stories and things. And I know some people have tried to do studies into this, like I think a guy called Michael Sabon, and there were questions about that study and the kind of timescales he used, because the time period, I would say that like some of the memory contamination stuff happens in a time period that he wasn't measuring. I think he was looking a bit later on, and so I don't think that rules out. And that I think there's very good evidence in, like as in, obviously there's a replication problem in psychology in general, right? But I think
and in medicine and other areas, yeah.
But I think as far as good psychological papers go, some of the stuff about like cognitive biases, schemas, and how schemas can like affect the way that we recall past events and piece together experiences that we've had and things, and the way that they can contaminate our recollection. I think they're fairly well attested. And in some of the cases that I looked at, so that, like what I think one of the most compelling ones was this Pam Reynolds case, where she had a brain aneurysm and heard like Hotel California at a point, or reports to have heard Hotel California at a point in the surgery where the blood should have been drained out of her brain or something. But James and I, who's a friend, we do the Bad Apologetics series together, and he's got a master's in neuroscience, currently doing his PhD in it as well.
Cool.
And yeah, we looked at like the reports from the surgeon's reports and so forth, what should have been going on at what times and things, and we kind of came up with naturalized theory of how these things could have happened, including things like anesthesia awareness and so forth, and which is, I think it was in like quite a worryingly high percentage of cases where barbiturates are used as the anesthetic that people like report still having experiences. And we looked at some of the other attempts to get at these phenomena, like the AWARE study, which was to do with I think it was cardiac heart attack patients, and trying to
Correct.
see if they reported that, if they reported any of these experiences, and then they kind of filter off, like the people. Well, firstly, it's the people who survived and the people who didn't survive, and it's like people who had experiences, people who didn't. I think there was one case in that AWARE study which reported one of these experiences which met all the criteria, and then the kind of details that were provided were fairly vague. They were like the guy was wearing blue, and he was kind of chubby or something like that. And these details again could quite easily be accounted for by some of that like memory contamination stuff, where people kind of have a schema of how they think like hospitals work, or maybe
random chance,
right? There are some of these things. I tend to think the socialization stuff plays quite a big role in these cases as well, when people are like retelling the phenomena, and so especially a lot of these people participate in communities that talk about these stories, and so they kind of build up like a theory of what's going on, and that layers the way they come to describe and interpret their own experiences. And
that has more weight today than it would prior to the 1970s, because it was really Raymond Moody's book Life After Life that introduced the NDE phenomena to popular consciousness. Right. I think the study of NDEs is fascinating, and I'm looking forward, and I think the results are intriguing that have been achieved so far are intriguing and promising, but I want to see more work done. I'm particularly looking forward to the results of the AWARE 2 study, and seeing what does that say? Which way does the evidence from that point? However, I understand NDEs are what you've taken a bit of a look at. I've looked at other areas of psi phenomena, and NDEs, while I'm interested in them, are not what I would go
they're
to
not the ones
as proof of psi phenomena. Yeah.
Which sort of like, because I mean, maybe I just need to look into these and kind of see what I find or something. But what are these examples? And I suppose a question that I have in mind with these as well is like, how does your theory of mind sort of account for these phenomena? Because I think, with some of the NDEs and OBEs, something that I found was that it was like, okay, there's this NDE, right? And so it's like, it supposedly refutes physicalism, but then it was never really clear what the alternative theory is supposed to be. So, like if these people are seeing at a different spatial point from their body, as their soul is something, but their soul is something non-physical, like why does it have a spatial location, or how is like there are questions like this about what the theory is for the
so let's talk about that just briefly, because there are different even though it's a human universal that there's a non-physical side to humanity, it's understood in different ways, and so there are different theories to consider. One theory that is a kind of prima facie theory. If someone says, okay, I had this experience where I left my body and I went somewhere and I experienced things and then I came back. Okay, that is, prima facie, that would sound like, okay, there's this detachable part of me, sometimes the name that will be applied to it is an astral body, and then the astral body detaches and goes somewhere else. Okay, well, maybe that's not the only way to explain this, though. Another way of explaining it would go back to the medieval explanation of how spirits interact in places. It was understood commonly in medieval metaphysics that spirits do not have locations, properly speaking. So you can't like point at a given set of coordinates and say there's literally a spirit is right there, it's contained in this volume of space. Instead, spirits were understood to have to not reside in any particular place, but they could be analogically said to be in a place where they affected the place. And so since my spirit is animating my body, it's psychokinetically keeping it alive, it's making sure it's an integrated functioning whole, you can say my spirit is in my body, even though properly speaking, it doesn't have a location. And in the same way, so if that understanding is true, if spirits don't properly have locations, but are capable of exercising influence at locations, then they would be inherently non-local. And so it would be possible, and you'll hear parapsychologists discussing non-local consciousness. It would be possible, in principle, if my spirit can interact with this patch of space where my body is located, then hypothetically, my non-local spirit could interact with any other patch of space where something else is going on. So we don't have to posit something like a detachable spirit body that can go visit places. It may just be, okay, the consciousness of a particular spirit is now looking at a different location than what it normally looks through.
I guess, I mean, maybe the kind of talk of analogical language for these spirit bodies, being able to interact in a certain place makes it like rationally permissible for someone who already believes this to adopt that position or something. But I think from my point of view, it's sort of not particularly compelling to move over to that position. It just because
we haven't, and given the format, we can't really dig into a lot of data today. Sure. I mean, you would obviously want to read before adopting a belief in psi phenomena, or you would want to do a whole bunch of reading first.
On the basis.
And I can make recommendations, but it's not what we're here for. But I understand that this wouldn't be persuasive. I'm just saying there are ways to account for this and to think rationally and critically about these issues. It's not just, it's not simply a pre-rational position, I guess I would say.
I think, something that motivates my physicalist view of mind as well is going to be something like Jae-Gwon Kim's pairing problem. So that might be an issue for something like what you were describing. And Kim kind of talks about, so the idea is, if we think about non-physical theories of mind, there's going to be this idea that people are still one-to-one, like one soul or one non-physical entity. It doesn't have to be soul, paired to one physical entity. And Kim wants to kind of question, well, sort of why think that if it doesn't have any spatial properties? And there is, like you can kind of formalize the argument by talking about how we pair physical events to physical locations, and the idea is that you have to basically appeal to spatial properties, but you can't do that in the case of a soul. So there's kind of no principled ground for set on that hypothesis for saying that like one.
The first thing that occurs to me in that regard would be they're not paired on us based on spatial location. They're paired on informational principles. Because I can have a computer and I can store lots of data in the cloud, and that data in the cloud can be located anywhere in the world, or even off if we want, create an orbital database or something. But there's an informational pairing that links what's in the cloud with what's on my local terminal. And in the same way, I would say the pairing between a spiritual entity like a soul and a body is informational rather than spatial. At least that's what occurs to me off the top of my head.
Yeah. I tend to find, I think implicit in some of these metaphors and analogies, like people like to use software and hardware analogies, for example, a lot.
Yep.
And I think it's again because people have this where it seems quite intuitive, that the software is like something over and above the hardware. But the problem I think will be as we dig into some of these analogies, we come to find that the information actually is like the physical state of something. So then again, it becomes difficult to say, well, where, how do we analogize that to something non-physical? Because like the data in this case is like, the physical state of some hardware somewhere, being transferred to your particular terminal. There's like a physical story of causation between, and then it's kind of, I mean, it never rules out this as a theory, but it seems like at some point, you kind of maybe just going to say, well, it just does interact or something. And then it's like,
Yeah, and there is a mystery here that I don't think anybody fully understands. But the same problem is going to repeat in all of these spaces. On the one hand, you can say, well, if we have information, it needs a physical substrate. And like on a hard drive, you've got a magnetic thing that encodes the data, and so it has a physical substrate. And in our brain, we've got a physical substrate that can encode data. But then that doesn't deal with the fact we've got a mind that includes data, and even the same data that's mirrored on our hardware, in our brain, in our wetware. It includes the same information. Like, I know Big Ben is in London, and I know that in my mind, and there's some brain state that corresponds to that. And so so there's a mystery here of how do these things relate, and you can collapse the mystery by saying the mind isn't really real, it's just the brain. Okay, that's a way of resolving the cognitive tension, but it doesn't actually disprove the thesis that prima facie my mind is different than my brain. I can have thoughts, I can have the thought of, a ruler 12 inches long, but that doesn't mean something in my brain is 12 inches long. That's probably I get it's helpful to go down the path. Yeah. In any event, my mind appears to not be the same as my brain. One way of collapsing the mystery is to say, okay, it's all physical, the rest is an illusion. Another way is to do the reverse. Say it's all mental and the physical world is an illusion. If you want to say, and there are people who do that, panpsychism is a popular option in some quarters these days. The mystery and the cognitive tension remains if you want to have a dualistic system where you're acknowledging the reality of both. But everybody's got the mystery, and you can deny it one way or another, but the mystery remains.
My own position wouldn't be like the illusionist position. Like I'd want to say that minds like really are real, like your seemings, your phenomenal experience and all that. But I'd just be saying it is physical. And then, and I would agree, given my theory, like my theory as well would say that we know about our own phenomenal lives by direct experience, but we know about how brains work differently. And so I think there's this kind of like an intentional shift that goes on, kind of like Descartes has this doubt argument, right, where he talks about, well, physical things have this property of being able to be doubted by me, but my mental life doesn't have a property of being able to be doubted by me. So the physical is not the mental. And most people, I mean, even people who are non-physicalists about mind don't accept this argument because, the relation of how something is known is that's like an epistemic context where it's not of things. It's not like de re that, matter has this property of being able to be doubted or something. And I think that can sometimes go it. That I think that some of that sort of thinking sometimes comes back though when we talk about like differences between our phenomenal lives and like things in the world, because there are there's these different ways in which we kind of like know about our own phenomenal states and things, and how we know about like things out there in the world. I'm happy if you want to say something about mind, and then maybe we could move on to like a different topic.
Sure.
It would be
I was thinking we've been spending a good bit of time in this one area. We probably want to talk about some others. So I don't know that I have anything particular to say at this point. I think that we have good prima facie evidence that mental and physical phenomena are different, and I think that is borne out or supported by various aspects of scientific data, including parapsychological data, that is often underappreciated. And I'd be happy to make some recommendations to you of resources you might find interesting in that regard. I'm thinking in particular of a dissertation that was for a doctor of philosophy in philosophy by a gentleman named Paul Smith, who was one of the U.S. Defense Department's former psychic spies. And he was a remote viewer, which is essentially to say a clairvoyant that was employed by the
This isn't the men who stare at goats stuff, right? Or is it something similar?
Well, they talk about the program in The Men Who Stare at Goats, which is a fun book. It's the remote viewers I know hate that book because it's done by John Ronson, who takes everything tongue in cheek, but Ronson writes a lot of fun stuff, but he describes himself as a kind of comedy journalist. But in any event, after the U.S. Government's program on this, Paul went on to get a PhD in philosophy, and he devoted his dissertation to from a philosophical perspective, what does psi phenomena reveal to us or suggest to us about a physicalist theory of mind. And so it's that dissertation. I mean, there's other stuff, but that dissertation is bang on what we're talking about.
Well, I'll check that out at some point. And I appreciate you not kind of like doing that move like you said, where there's something you've looked into in this case, and I've not, as something you could like bring it up and be like, so how do you explain this thing you've never heard of before?
Yeah, no, I try to follow the golden rule. I want to treat everybody the way I want to be treated, and not everybody knows the same stuff. So, I don't believe in data ambushes.
Okay, so maybe the next topic then. If we go back to sort of arguments for God's existence and so forth, is there like I kind of highlighted some of my problems and things, and you said that some of these can these can provide good reasons for someone who kind of like removes the barriers in the ways of the premises or something to kind of give quite high levels of confidence in the conclusion. And I was wondering, I mean, do you have in mind that something more like a contingency argument or something? Is that because that tends to be
I of all the different general approaches to proving the existence of God, the one that I find most appealing is the contingency argument. I also find appealing the ontological argument. But if I'm talking to a typical person, contingency is going to be my go-to. Because it seems apparent to me that we have contingent things in the world. I mean, my hand is a contingent thing. It could be here or it could be here. And so my hand is clearly contingent, and anything that is contingent and is in a particular definite state, it's here, not there, needs an explanation for why it is the way it is now. Not talking about its history and how it got to this point, but why is it the way it is now? And so if you take my hand as an example, well, the reason it is where it is now is because I'm using my central my central nervous system is controlling my muscles to hold it in this place. And say, okay, let's take it down a level of analysis. What is your central nervous system? Why is your central nervous system the way it is right now? And you might, on a physicalist understanding, try to explain that exclusively in terms of, subatomic phenomena. You've got these atoms that are interacting chemically and are transmitting messages and so forth. Okay, so then why are those the way they are now? Well, we could derail ourselves by getting back onto a mind discussion, but we won't do that. But why are the atoms the way they are? And you can try to use quantum mechanics or something to explain that. And you still, even once you have a quantum mechanical understanding of how atoms work, you still need to say, well, why are these atoms doing what they're doing now? And maybe there's some deeper level than quantum mechanics that we have yet to discover. But my intuition is strongly that it is not turtles all the way down, that there cannot be an infinite chain of explanations, because if you propose an infinite chain of explanations, you don't ultimately explain anything. I think there must be some fundamental explanation for why things are the way they are now. And that fundamental explanation, whatever it is what I would refer to as God. And then it's a question of building a more robust understanding of God from that point. So that's in short form, that's, the general approach I tend to prefer.
And just to ask you in terms of contingency here, you mean like explanation, right? Because sometimes, like Aquinas' third way is sometimes put forward in terms of like ontological dependence or something. Are you thinking would you say that's like a different kind of argument to this, and this is more like a Leibnizian contingency?
Yeah, I tend to think in terms, I agree that God is also the ontological cause of all these things, but that notion is if I'm talking to someone who's a non-specialist, explanation, people understand what explanations are. They don't understand what ontological causes are.
Right.
So I tend to use I try to be user-friendly liveware.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I find this interesting because I actually do accept, the idea. I also share the intuition that there aren't these infinite chains of explanation, but I guess I don't think I would accept it on the same grounds. But it's sort of not a hill worth dying on, because so I think that.
What are your grounds?
It's similar to the other cases actually, in terms of like going with the best explanation. I just kind of look at like what would it the explanation that maximizes explanatory power and minimizes commitments be, and and it's like the finite chain, right? In the causal, like like in the Kalam type cosmological argument, and also in the explanation sense, I think like models of reality. Like you can have a circular or an infinite explanatory model of reality, but I think that model of reality just has far more commitments than like the finite chain one, and so that's why
William of Ockham gives you a gold star. Yeah.
Okay. So it's weird, like because I always see this one motivated by the infinities and stuff, but I do struggle with that. I know Aquinas similarly had issues with infinities in some cases, and I think he thought I think, and I could be wrong, that the only one he thought that the actual you could like say there can't be an infinity was the potency and act, the change argument, because he thought that you couldn't have an infinite chain there because if you wouldn't ever get like anything in act if the chain, need a first thing or something like that. And I still kind of, maybe I just need to think about Aquinas's reasons there more, because I think everything could be an act just insofar as it is in act by whatever's causing it to change, but it would just be an infinite chain. Like I don't see why it couldn't be infinite.
Here's an area where I disagree with Aquinas. So Aquinas thinks there are lots of infinities that don't work or that you couldn't actualize. He thinks you could, because he rejects the Kalam argument, and I reject the philosophical Kalam argument as well. He thinks you could have an infinite past, and I gather he would defend that on the idea that that Aristotle would have, that it's not, because only one moment of time is real at a time, it's not an actual infinity. I think that's nonsense. I think it would be an actually infinite chunk of space-time, but that's okay with me because I don't have a problem with actual physical infinities. What I have a problem with is, so if someone wants to say the universe is infinite, well, we know it's at least like 50 times bigger than the visible universe because of its flatness, observable flatness. We don't know that it's infinite. But if someone wanted to say it's spatially infinite, that's okay with me. I don't have a problem with that. But I do have a problem with beginningless chains of explanation, because I don't think they ultimately explain anything.
I guess, so I think in the way you say that, when you say they don't ultimately explain anything, and I guess if ultimate explanation means like there's not a stopping point in the explanation, right, then that's true. But I mean, I think for, like I say, it's not this isn't a hill worth dying on, because I sort of agree with you in the premise, but it's like if okay, but the person who says that there's an infinite chain of explanation is just saying, there isn't an ultimate explanation of anything, but everything is just explained by whatever explains it, and that goes on to infinity. It's isn't there kind of like a parity here between the causation case or whatever, where it's like
there's a similarity. In my case, though, we at some point we hit our fundamental philosophical intuitions. Right. And my fundamental intuition is that there is an ultimate explanation. We may or may not be able to find it, but I think my intuition is there must be one. That because otherwise the world would seem to be missing something that my intuition says it inherently needs.
And when you say like,
and I would also say that the drive to find explanations, including fundamental ones, is innate to human nature. So I'm just acting as a human when I look for an ultimate explanation for something.
And just thinking about what, so we're kind of both on board at this point. I think that there's like a finite, the explanation of everything is finite, right? Let's put it that way. And so, what that explanation is, I guess, how do you think that we should think about it? So should we think about it that explanation is like an explanation of some other explanation that explains something else? Or should we think it like that explanation is something which includes like a description of everything and why it is the way that it is, sort of thing? I mean, how do you think about that first? The stopping.
Could you? I'm not entirely sure I follow. Could you say that again?
So I'm thinking that there could be like a couple of ways of thinking about. So supposing that there's like a finite chain of explanations or something, I'm thinking there could be a couple of ways that we could understand that first explanation, and one of them would kind of be that first explanation, like it explains something else, right? But it kind of doesn't say much about the whole, as it were. It just says something about whereas there's another way where it's like, that stopping point for explanation sort of contains, within that explanation, everything else is, rather than it being kind of more modular.
Right. So if I understand correctly, and tell me if I'm wrong, but if I understand correctly, we're dealing essentially with secondary causation. So it could be that the ultimate explanation itself directly explains every single little thing in the world, and it causes those things. It's the ontological cause of every single little thing directly, with no intermediate causation. And on the other hand, the ultimate explanation, there may be intermediate causes. There may be different layers of analysis. There may be different levels in which other entities are acting. So other entities may have agency. But I would say that the ultimate explanation would be the fundamental one, that in one way or another explains everything that happens underneath it. Well, okay, so posing the question in that way, I would say it's hypothetically possible it could be either way. If someone wanted to say, well, God determines the position of every electron in the universe, and there's no free will, there's no intermediate causality, it's just one step, bang, and you're at the God level. Well, okay, you can propose that. That's not, I mean, if God chose to do it that way, I'd say God could do it that way. But I don't think that's consistent with the data we see in the universe, which looks like there's intermediate causation working. I seem to have free will. I seem to be an intermediate agent that's affecting the world. Other people seem to be the same way. And furthermore, if one gets to the point of believing in Scripture as God's word, Scripture openly declares that God uses intermediate causation. And so I would say it's not logically impossible that God could be the direct cause of every single thing in the world. I would say he could do that, and he may have universes where he does that, but that doesn't appear to be the universe we live in.
That helps, because it helps me to sort of see. I think we are talking about it in the same way then, in terms of how we're understanding like the ultimate explanation, maybe. So, like so we're both on board so far, right? We both agree with each other that there's like a finite set of explanations, and that first explanation, it does explain everything, but it's not like a description of just like everything that's happening and stuff like that. So, okay, what's the kind of next step then? So have we reached? I suppose it's identifying or talking about what that explanation must be like. Maybe this is the what's it? Et hoc omnes intelligent deum, or whatever. This all men call God, which because I think I agree with the first part of the argument, and then I just sort of don't think that it drives me towards a God. So maybe you could talk about like that kind of what's called the gap problem sometimes. Like, how do you see reason getting us through that?
So I acknowledge that this ultimate explanation, whatever it is, as far as the argument I've used to frame it, involves pretty minimal commitments. It does not entail that you must believe God is a Trinity, for example. In fact, the Catholic Church teaches no philosophical argument is going to entail that you must believe God is a Trinity. That's something that is a matter of divine revelation that we couldn't know unless God told us. But it doesn't get us as far as St. Paul, who believes that God is a person or is personal, and we haven't shown that when it comes to this ultimate explanation. I think you can show that the ultimate explanation, whatever it is, but we can kind of build out certain things about it. One of them, I think, is that the ultimate explanation must be time independent, because otherwise, how do we explain time? So I think it must be time independent. It also must, since it explains all the physical universe. Wow. Okay. That's powerful. Something that is the explanation for all of the physical universe, that involves either infinite power or very, very high level of superhuman power. And so I think we could say that that the ultimate explanation, or that which all men call God, is eternal in the outside of time or non-time dependent sense, and all powerful, at least in the sense of it has power over everything that exists, which is distinct from the Thomistic power over everything that could exist view. That would be a separate issue, but it would have a meaning. What could meaningfully be described as omnipotence, because it has power over all things that exist, since it's the explanation for all things that exists. The big question is this personal or not? And I don't think that the argument we've presented so far shows that it's personal. I think that we need to introduce new argumentation to show that. One, and this is where I have some sympathy for the ontological argument. I have trouble, as Cardinal Newman said, putting it into figure and mood, but I have a profound intuition, personally, just speaking for myself, that the fundamental explanation must be infinitely perfect. And I don't see how the fundamental explanation for everything could be imperfect or limited. And so I think conceptually, and that gets us to the ontological argument, I think it must be a perfect being. And I think a perfect being is going to have mental or personal qualities like we do. And so that would be one way of approaching the question of how do we know the ultimate cause is personal. There are other ways of approaching it as well, like if it makes first contact with us. if it is a person and it makes first contact with us and talks to us and reveals personal qualities through that interaction, that also gives us reason to believe that that the ultimate cause is personal. And I would say that the Christian faith claims that that is exactly what's happened, that the ultimate cause has made contact with us, has given us signs. I would point in particular to the resurrection of Christ, but has given us signs of its reality, and that it transcends the purely natural, and that it is personal. And so I would say you can also build out the personal dimension of the ultimate cause in a kind of, not an a priori way, but in an a posteriori evidential way, based on what we see in the universe and its history via divine contact.
So I obviously, differ from like how you get through from where we kind of left to God. So I think, according to me, or the way that I think about it is that, the or one candidate, right? And this isn't to say that I really, really strongly believe this is something, but at least what I see as being, again, the most kind of parsimonious way of dealing with, okay, I'm committed to these set of claims that are a part of like a contingency argument. What ways can I make sense of that? And what I see is being the most parsimonious is something like that hypothesis that the initial state of the universe is necessary. So like that, like you were saying before, we look at like natural reality is this like 4-dimensional manifold of space-time or whatever. And one hypothesis at least is to say, well, that initial state is necessary, and then everything else, and we're still talking in terms of explanation here, and then we have some theory of modality, which is going to say, well, I'm being crude here, but the chancy swerving of atoms or something from that initial state can introduce some contingency after that. And I wonder, how would you go about, through reason, getting me from thinking about it in that way to maybe having, I'm not supposing that you're going to get me the whole way to kind of where you are, but I'm thinking, what are
that would be a bit asking a bit much for one conversation. Yeah.
Right. So what, where do you think I'm going wrong? Where should I be thinking about these things differently given what I've just described?
Okay. So one way of approaching it would be, and I'm thinking a bit off the top of my head here, because I haven't interacted directly with the way you've expressed it. It sounds like you're saying that the initial let me make sure I understand your position first. Or the hypothesis you're entertaining. It sounds like you would say, okay, the beginning of the initial moment of the universe is necessary, and everything that follows from that. It wasn't clear to me if you were saying that it involved random causation or just contingent causation. I don't know that I actually need to resolve that question, though. What I would want to understand better is what is necessary about the initial state of the universe on this hypothesis. And fundamentally, I would say, well, okay, it seems to me that the initial state of the universe is not itself time independent, and therefore it's subject to time. And if it's subject to time, let's say it's a seemingly random collection of particles that are in a certain state, or fields that are in a certain state that then, as it expands, they collapse into particles and stuff. But it's some initial physical thing. Okay, I would want to say, why is it the way it is? It's just a contingency argument again. Why wouldn't it? Why couldn't it be some other state of random fields or particles or something? And so I would say it doesn't feel to me like we've got a good candidate for an ultimate explanation. It's like you could propose, okay, right now is the only slice of time that exists There's no past and no future. It's only right now. All the rest is an illusion. And the ultimate explanation for everything is it's just this set of particles in this configuration. Okay, well, you could propose that, but it doesn't sound to me like that's a satisfying explanation for the world. I mean, even let's talk about how the particles got here is more satisfying than that. And it seems to me if you just take that, freeze a moment of time and say that's the ultimate explanation, it doesn't sound to me like it's a better explanation if you just put it at the beginning than if you put it right now.
So yeah, in response, so the first thing of like you know, like the running the contingency argument, and you know, I'm not saying this to be like weird or anything, but it's like, you know, the explanation kind of just is that it's necessary, right? So it's like, you know, it's kind of like asking when the theist says, well, what explains God or something, it's like to say, well, that is, you know, that is the explanation, like that
well, he's the non-contingent thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the contingency argument is that all the contingent things must go back to some non-contingent thing. And then it's a nonsense question to say, what is the non-contingent thing contingent on?
And so it's kind of similar, you know, if you say that, well, the initial physical state of the universe is necessary. And you say, well, what explains why it's necessary rather than, and it's like, well, it's necessary. That's what explains it, you know, kind of.
And what I'm doing in that picture is I mean, I acknowledge that's a legitimate conceptual. I mean, it doesn't, at least at first analysis, it doesn't involve a contradiction. So you could propose it. I'm just saying I find it unappealing, just as I would find it unappealing to take the current slice of space-time and say that's all that exists and that's the only explanation there is. I don't think that's a satisfying one. Most people are, well, nobody is satisfied with that because everybody lives their lives and attributes more explanation to the universe than just that. And if you say, well, just the initial state is that way, well, I could imagine other initial states. So why would this one be it? It seems ad hoc to just say that, in the same way it would be ad hoc to say the current slice of space-time is the ultimate explanation and the only thing that exists.
Okay, so that's good. It gives in terms of, you know, like the idea that it's ad hoc to make a move like this. So I tend to think of
unsatisfying.
And unsatisfying. I'd agree. I also agree it's unsatisfying, right? It's satisfying in the sense that it like answers all the questions that I have about it, and I can't figure out what's wrong with it, right? But it's unsatisfying in like an existential sense, or like a, something like that. I agree.
Cognitively, it's unsatisfying because humans are programmed to seek reasons for stuff, and if you just take a moment and say, okay, this is a brute fact, there is no reason for this, and if you apply that to everything, it undermines the entire human enterprise, which involves interacting with the world and figuring it out and using that information to make things better for ourselves. It collapses science. It collapses everything.
I think it's a bit unfair to say it's, that it's cognitively unsatisfying on the grounds that it doesn't give us some further reason to think it is the case or something, because it's sort of like saying, if that's true, then the atheist should be able to say, well, like the theistic explanation is cognitively unsatisfying because there isn't some further reason in virtue of which God exists or something, right? Like
I would, sure. Yeah. And so let's talk about that. I would agree that there's a fundamental human drive to find reasons for everything. And to find explanations for everything. That's built into our drive. That's built into our nature. And so we find it unsatisfying when we can't do that. But there will be situations, if unless you want to propose turtles all the way down, infinite regressive explanations, there will be a bedrock explanation, and we will at that point have the 5-year-old impulse to say, but who created God? And the answer is, at this point, we've reached a bedrock level. And so that question no longer makes sense, just like what south of the South Pole makes no sense. when you understand the question. But it's still, we have that impulse. Oh, what is south of the South Pole? That sounds fascinating. And so this aspect of human nature is doomed to be frustrated, that there will always be things that we would love to say, what's the reason for that? And there at some point will be no further reason.
And I think that response sort of holds in the case of, the proposed hypothesis that the initial physical state is necessary, right? Because it might be that, like, you want more of something, but it's in some sense that's misguided. And I think that's true whether someone rejects the theist saying it's necessary on those grounds, or someone rejects this hypothesis on those grounds. Maybe we could talk about the ad hocness. I guess so something. I think sometimes things can seem ad hoc because they're like temporally motivated by a question, right, which they kind of answer. Whereas I think in terms of theory comparison, I understand ad hocness to be like a vice of a theory because it adds theoretical bloat. So maybe I can say something that will kind of explain that a bit further. So one reason, so suppose there's some kind of property or something, right, that we're trying to explain.
While you explain, I'm going to smoke my pipe.
Okay, no problem. There's some property that we're trying to explain in like a bunch of objects. So let's say like, A, B, C, D, E, and F or something are like our objects. It doesn't really matter. It's just some objects, and they all have this particular phenomena, right? And so someone comes up with a hypothesis as to why, as to why they'll have this phenomena, and then
by that phenomena, do you mean characteristic?
Oh yeah, sorry, the property. Yeah,
okay.
I'm misspeaking. Okay. Yeah, why they have that property. So, and the person who's got this hypothesis, or they say, well, these A objects, they have the property in virtue of A prime or something, and B objects, they have the property in virtue of B prime. C objects, they have the virtue and property of C prime. D object, and so on. And the point is that the proposed hypothesis here, it's not a very good explanation, because for each instance of the thing that it's supposed to explain or describe, you've just got the property to be described, but like repackaged. And so it's a very bloated theory that's kind of, it's no better than just saying that thing happens. What you really want from an explanation is something that's kind of, deeply unifying, and it tells you something about why, maybe it's contrastive, right? It tells you like why that one's happening as opposed to that one. Now, that obviously in the case of necessity, maybe the contrastive thing isn't gonna that's not gonna be the case, because we're talking about necessities here. But I tend not to think that it's an ad hoc move, because I can't see how it bloats the physicalist theory in any way, right? It seems actually like it's a very a very concise move to make, to just say, well, yeah, okay, I agree. I have these other commitments to the premises of, like the contingency argument. And so now I'm going to just think about my worldview as a whole. I guess it follows that the initial physical state is necessary. And then if there's like a different, at least the way I view it, if there's like a different if there's a different worldview, say, so like theism, that says, well, here's a different way of modeling things, right? The initial state isn't necessary. That's contingent as well. But now there's this additional entity called God that explains it, and so forth. And I just look at those as different kind of models of what's going on there. And I say, well, I think in the case of the theist model, it doesn't really, and I think there are potentially, I'm not saying it's like ad hoc, like it's something that's being done as like a vice or something, but I think some of these questions about, well, like, why is that, if the initial physical state is contingent, why is it this physical state as opposed to that physical state, right? And I think answers to those questions are relatively ad hoc. It's going to be like, well, it just is. It's like a brute contingency, because like God chose that one rather than that one or something. And so I look at it through the theory comparison lens again, right? And I'm kind of thinking the naturalist has an edge here, at least in terms of like parsimony and stuff. But I don't know. Maybe that doesn't answer though your concern that it's an ad hoc move to make.
Well, I think it may. I think we may have different approaches to what makes something or why something being ad hoc is bad. I don't tend to think of it in terms of adding conceptual bloat as much as I just want to understand why this thing is different than that thing. Why is it this way and not that way? And to say, well, it's just this way is unsatisfying. And because that doesn't really tell me anything. And it also seems to be, since the universe is constantly changing, we know it can take many vast numbers of different, states, and it doesn't feel like an explanation to assert, well, this is just a brute fact. But one thing that I think does have, and this is more of a worldview comparison model, one thing that I think does drive this, I haven't tried to articulate this before, but let's see. In fact, aspects of this are new to me, but let's see how I can do with it. Sure. Suppose that some kind of super Calvinist God exists. So God is everything about God, not just is everything about the world determined in all its details by God, but God himself has no free will. And so God himself, everything about God is just as determined and just as necessary. And it seems to me that if that's the case, what you've not only done is turned the universe into a machine, you've turned God into a machine. And all you've really done to say God is the explanation of the universe at that point is explain one machine in terms of it's all built by another machine. And you haven't gone to an ultimate explanation really that's satisfying. Whereas if you tell a children, so let's bring it back to fundamental human experience for a moment. Kids ask why things are the way they are. And so if the child says, why are we having, chocolate ice cream for dessert tonight instead of strawberry ice cream? The child will not be satisfied with the answer. It's just a brute fact. There is no reason. We are just having chocolate rather than strawberry tonight. But if you say to the child, because that's what mom chose to get when she went to the store, the child finds that personalistic explanation of the fact much more satisfying. And so if you attribute, so yes, the initial state of the universe, I can imagine multiple initial states of the universe. And if you just assert one of them as a brute fact, it's unsatisfying. But if God chose it, if a person chose something, that's a more satisfying explanation. And so I think that there is a fundamental drive in humanity to go back to ultimate personalistic explanations, which is the reason why even in cultures that haven't had contact with the God of the Bible, they find personalistic explanations for the world. And that's why you have gods in all these different cultures. And so, and I'm, by the way, I'm not, well, that would get us into a whole other area. I think in terms of a worldview explanation, people, including small children and including myself, will be fundamentally more satisfied if the ultimate explanation is personal than if it is not. And so I think there's an innate appeal on the intuitive level to a personalistic understanding of the ultimate explanation.
Well,
and that may be that for some people will be a way to decide between or break the impasse over between the two hypotheses.
I definitely agree with you that there's something about it that isn't satisfying, though I struggle to put my finger on what it is. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering if you would be able to kind of try and articulate what it is about the theistic explanation that is satisfying. Why is it that when you reach that point, you know, some of these same concerns and questions kind of don't arise. Like, why is that one satisfying, I suppose?
So, it's something I haven't tried to articulate before, so I can probably do a better job in the future.
Okay, sure.
But in terms of processing it cognitively, now there are also practical. There's a practical appeal to it too, because so let's do cognitive first, if I can. Cognitively, I understand choices because I make them. And so I understand, okay, I could do this thing this way, I could do this thing that way. I make a choice between those, and I understand that. And so it makes sense to me, well, if we have this multitude of initial states that could have been, why is there one initial state? Well, choice. God made a choice. I understand choices. I do that all the time. That could be why. So I find that more appealing, not just emotionally, but cognitively, because I have an intuitive experience of what making choices is. And it seems more satisfying to say, okay, it was a choice, rather than randomly a brute fact. So I think that's one aspect of it. There are also other aspects, like, and these are non-cognitive, but that doesn't deprive them of value. Human beings like to have good stuff, and they like to have things go well, and they like to be loved. And all of that is possible if the ultimate explanation is personal. And it's not possible if the ultimate explanation is not personal. And so I would just rather live in a universe where there's a God who loves me and looks out for me. And I know that's not evidence in the cognitive sense, but it is something that, you could actually argue, as St. Augustine did, that actually it is evidence, that I'm built for that, and that corresponds to reality. So C.S. Lewis made a similar point. But even if you don't say that's evidence, okay, well, if the only other live option is materialism, then I'm doing a kind of William James move here. If the live hypothesis for me are God exists and materialism is true, then it would be very hard for me to see how, on a materialist account, I would be doing anything wrong by believing in God anyway.
Okay.
Because if
it's adaptive, if it's adaptive for you as an organism or something, is that what the direction?
That's part of it. That's part of it, but also just on moral grounds. So if I'm a moral realist and I'm a non-naturalist moral realist, I don't think right and wrong are properties you can measure in a lab. They're fundamentally non-empirical. And if we adopt a kind of scientific approach to where everything has to be empirically verified, or you shouldn't believe it, it's immoral to believe it just if it's not empirically supported, then morality is non-empirically supported, and therefore it wouldn't exist. And I wouldn't be doing anything wrong to believe in God. So I have a kind of Pascal's wager situation. I could, if I'm not convinced by the evidence, but I need to make a decision, am I going to live my life as a materialist or as a theist? If I assume materialism is true, it is not wrong for me to become a theist. And if I assume theism is true, it would be wrong for me to become a materialist. Therefore, obviously, the thing to do, just be a theist. There's a God. He loves me. He explains things. I can relate to him. I can be with him forever. It's going to be so cool. So that's the obvious choice at that point. Why wouldn't I want to do that?
I definitely agree with what you're saying about, like those non-cognitive reasons to favor an explanation, and there are some good some good conversations, on the nature of ultimate explanation between, like, I think it's something that Josh Rasmussen and Felipe Leon talk about in their book, like, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? Something I think that Oppie talked about when he talked to Rasmussen, and Oppie and Koons as well. I think they talked about the gap problem on Joe Schmid's channel. And I do think, it's very difficult. It's like a very difficult question. Like, how do you decide between those things? And I do agree with you that there is something for me that's unsatisfying about saying the initial physical state is necessary, like it just had to be that way. But at the same time, I struggle to find the like other considerations that would make it an explanation more satisfying in like maybe like a moral or an aesthetic sense or something for me to like that I don't find that they kind of override the benefits of the more parsimonious explanation or something. And so that's kind of where I am with that.
So I have a theory about parsimony that I've never published about this, but I've thought about doing so. I think the reason that humans like parsimony is because we have limited cognitive faculties, and we have we're not omniscient. We have to reason our way through things, and we have limited time and mental energy for doing that. And so evolutionarily, that's going to bias us towards the simplest explanations possible. And because that's the most economic use of our resources, is to go for the simplest thing that works. And so I don't think, considered abstractly from a perspective of pure reason, that parsimony is an intrinsic epistemic virtue. I think that humans find it attractive because it makes for an economic use of our cognitive resources. And it could be the case. I mean, like, I sometimes think about this, and I really should publish about this at some point, but if you think about like a series of 3 dots, and you say, how should these dots be connected? Well, okay, a straight line is the most parsimonious, if you want to put it that way of connecting them. But there are actually an infinite number of different lines that could be drawn connecting those 3 points. There is an infinite number of mathematical functions on which those points will appear on a plot. And so you've got 3 data points, but there's an infinite number of way of collecting, of coordinating that data. And so that's a microcosm of our overall mental experience. We have a finite number of data points about the world, and there are an infinite number of ways of connecting them. And so it could be that Einstein was wrong. Gravity is not curved space-time. The planets are being pushed by invisible gnomes into the invisible gnome cover-up. Or maybe it's not gnomes. Maybe it's satyrs or sylphs, or or tiny electro ants.
The machine elves. Didn't you just do an episode on machine elves or something, or did I get recommended it?
I did recently talk about psychedelic machine elves. Yeah, maybe they're doing it. So there are an infinite number of possible explanations, and as humans, we're attracted to parsimony, and parsimony is a good rule of thumb, but it's not an absolute value. And even parsimony, is when we apply it, I mean, one of the things we found over time is you can have an initial good parsimonious approximation that lets you predict a phenomenon, but with time you're going to notice variations that require you to refine and adopt a slightly more complex, slightly, from the previous perspective, slightly less parsimonious explanation, like the shift from Newtonian gravity to relativistic gravity. That was required by observations. Why did Mercury have this weird orbit that Newton's equations didn't predict? And we got a slightly more complex, but ultimately more powerful explanation. And so I appreciate your concern for parsimony. I would just, as you think about these issues, I would recognize that parsimony is only a relative value. And so even if a particular approach seems more parsimonious because it cuts out more entities, obviously there are obvious difficulties with that. And I would just encourage you to think about competing values in addition to, I love parsimony, use it all the time. But it's not an absolute. And so I would just encourage you to think about additional cognitive values as well. In case that's helpful.
No, I think, something I'm thinking as at least a takeaway from this conversation is I do share this sense with you that the hypothesis I'm going with is unsatisfying in some sense. And so what I want to do is kind of, dig into, I need to think about, what is a satisfying explanation according to me, or what do I really think that an explanation has to do? And I need to spend some more time just thinking about that, maybe reading about that. And that might help me to understand the theistic position here a bit more, is my thinking. I don't know if you want to say anything in response to that, and then I've got some questions just because I'm a bit, we've gone for 2.5 hours now, and I don't want to keep you forever. So is there anything you want to say in response to that? Or
not in response to that. So one of the things, it sounds to me, based on the reading and the videos I did regarding you, and I don't know what your current exact situation is, but it seems to me that it sounds like you're very much in the position of the person that Pascal was writing for when he introduces the wager argument. That person is someone who is, for whom theism is a live option, but who also is, for whom materialism is a live option. And or technically, to use James's terms, they're both live hypotheses, and the option is the decision between them. And you don't feel you have conclusive evidential reasons to favor one over the other, but you find belief attractive, and so you go to church and you sing and you pray and do things like that. And I think that's all great. Because even if materialism were true, which I don't think it is, but even if it were, you're not doing anything wrong. You're actually fulfilling your human nature, because religion is a human universal, and it exists in every society. It's how we're built. Atheists are always the minority in every society in world history. Materialists certainly are. And so you're actually acting in accord with your nature as a human, just speaking anthropologically, regardless of these metaphysical issues. And so I would say, go human, be a human. Don't worry about it. Just relax and be a human. And in terms of living through cognitive tension, where you may not have all the evidence you would want for the position, I would say, okay, that's fine. Living in a wager is okay. Where I don't have fundamental proof of this, but I see it's in my interest to act on this premise. So I'm going to act on this premise, and I'm not going to worry about it beyond that, because I don't need to. There is no, if the counter hypothesis is true, there's no reason I need to worry about this. So I'm just gonna do what is good for me. I'm gonna act on the premise that I live in a theistic universe rather than a materialistic one. Regardless of the cognitive situation, that will be better for me. As sociological studies indicate, people who are religious have more happiness, better life outcomes, they live longer, all these things, because that religious mode of life is in keeping with human nature. And so it promotes human flourishing. And so I think you're in a good position. I would just encourage you to experience less anxiety about the position you're in. Just say, okay, I'm acting on this premise, and follow the advice that Pascal said to his imaginary interlocutor. If you feel doubtful about all this and would like to believe, well, then begin by the way other people have. Act on the principle this is true. Take holy water, have masses said, and eventually the mode of action you adopt will alleviate the anxiety that you experience over this. So cognitive argument, and I think it's also great to study cognitive arguments, but I think it's in every human being's interest to be religious because it promotes human flourishing. I happen to think Christianity is true, and I'll give you loads, and Catholic Christianity in particular, I'll give you loads of cognitive arguments for that. But I think you're in a good place, and I would just encourage you to go forward and continue and not be as worried about the alternative, because if the alternative were true, you're not doing anything wrong, and you'll be happier this way.
Well, I appreciate the thought. I guess there's something about the sense of a sense of maybe like bad faith or, like intellectual dishonesty I would feel in it.
Yeah, that's why I asked about that first. Do you think you're doing anything wrong by doing this? But it's not bad faith, because you don't have...
wrong in going to church and stuff, but what I think would be wrong is for me to
intellectual bad faith. Yeah.
I think it would be like if I were like convincing myself of propositions that I didn't think were true or something. That's what I would feel bad about. But like just going to church and reading the Bible devotion.
But you shouldn't, because if materialism is true, then it's very hard to see how anything can be wrong if everything must be empirically supported. That would apply to moral claims as well. And so I understand that that we have built into us a moral sense that says don't deceive yourself. But that don't deceive yourself ethic is only binding on the premise that non-empirical things exist that go beyond the purely empirical material. And so if your heart's telling you that that you want to be religious, and believe religious things, which are the underpinnings of religious practice, then and you also want to not deceive yourself, the logical explanation to bring those together is, well, on the one hand, if I happen to be wrong, intellectually, factually wrong about religion, then I'm not doing anything morally wrong. But if I am right, then all of if it's right that these religious claims are true, that makes sense of both my impulse to believe in non-empirical things like right and wrong, and I know I'm not doing anything wrong by believing in God. So again, the factors align in such a way that no matter which theory you are considering, it points towards being religious as the obvious solution, that where everything coheres in terms of the matters under concern.
I think I still, I'm not sure I'm on board with everything in that argument, just because. Well, I mean,
I've only just proposed it. Obviously, you need to think about it.
Yeah, I'll think about it, but at least like given my current sort of the current way I think about meta ethics and normative ethics and so forth, like it doesn't. I don't believe that given a version of naturalism, like it's a good thing to like convince myself of things that I have like lower credences in or something like that, and that would.
Okay, I'd be curious about that. Real briefly before you get to your other questions.
Yeah, sure.
But real briefly. So, supposing a version of naturalistic ethical realism like utilitarianism, or some kind of eudaimonistic, happiness-based ethic. I don't know what ethic you would propose, but a common one is happiness or something like happiness. And it seems to me that, and this is one of the reasons I actually don't like naturalistic theories of moral realism, because if it turns out it makes you happy to believe something that's false, it would be the right thing to do to go ahead and believe the false thing, just because it makes you happy, because happiness is the virtue that has been singled out as the one that we're going to identify with moral goodness. I think that's a mistake. But if you're entertaining a naturalistic understanding of moral realism, then I would encourage you to think about that, the kind of move I just did, and see whether it really would deter you from saying, okay, I want to believe this. I don't have good evidence against it, so I'm going to make a leap of faith. Per William James.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. And I do sometimes think about things along those lines. So I'll consider that a bit more, for sure. So in terms of the questions that we have got throughout the time that we've been talking, John Buck, thank you for the super chat, first asks, how should Catholics understand some Latin that I can't read? Extra ecclesiam
nullis alice.
In light of Vatican II. There you go.
Okay. So I should explain what these terms mean. It's hard how to say all this concisely. Extra ecclesiam nullis alice is
no
Latin
salvation out of the church or something?
No salvation outside the church, yeah. And there's been, over the course of history, I'll try to make this as brief as I can. Over the course of history, there's been a shift on thinking in terms of who is able to be saved. And in the early church, it was commonly understood that, okay, God sent Jesus to us so we can be saved, so we need to believe in him. He's given us evidence of the truth of his claims via his resurrection from the dead, among other things. So we need to accept that and become Christians, and that's how we can be saved. But it was also understood that not everybody had to be a Christian in order to be saved, because you had people who had never heard the gospel and not been given or maybe heard it, but not been given good evidence for it. And nevertheless, they were living lives of moral virtue, just like people had before the time of Christ. Obviously, all the people who lived before Jesus but were doing what God wanted, King David, let's say, they're not going to go to hell just because they weren't Christians. And so there was this recognition that that the obligation to be a Christian only applied to people in specific situations, like where you've heard the gospel, you've been given adequate evidence for it, and that evidence should compel you or create an obligation on you to accept it. And then you get baptized and you'd enter the church and you'd be a Christian and experience salvation. But it was recognized in the early church that lots of people didn't fit that description. And so it was possible for salvation to be experienced by people in other situations. They would even talk about like the Greek philosophers who reasoned partway to God as living in accord with logos, which means reason. But it's also who Jesus is. He's the Logos. He's the Word of God. He's the reason of God. And so these people implicitly were living according to Jesus without a conscious awareness of it. And that could apply to other people. Well, then the Christian message was spread far and wide. Everybody in Europe basically was a Christian. People in Africa were Christian. In North Africa were Christians. In the Middle East were Christians. And then Islam happened and took away the part of Christendom that was in North Africa and the Middle East. But those people had still heard the gospel. And so we're now talking about the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, it was assumed, okay, basically everybody's heard the gospel. And if you have rejected, so we're not in that old situation where there are lots of people who've never heard. Basically, everyone's heard the gospel. They've had a chance to respond to it. If they've rejected it, like if they're a Muslim or a Jew or something, then or a heretic that's left the church for some false belief system, then it's their own fault. They're culpable for that. And so they've endangered their salvation. And so outside of the church, there wouldn't be any salvation. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Then we discovered the New World. Suddenly, millions of people have never heard the gospel, and theologians needed to take that, to absorb that, and to digest it, and take that into account. And so it was realized we're much more in a position where lots of people are not Christians through no fault of their own. Either they haven't heard the gospel, they haven't been shown evidence for it, they were raised in a contrary belief system, and people naturally believe what they're taught when they're kids. They need to do that. It's how they become members of a culture and survive. So it's rational for them to believe whatever religion they were taught. They're not at fault for doing that. It's only if you've, dived into the evidence that you would be persuaded rationally that the religion you were born with, needs to be revised or rejected. And so, by the 20th century, you had popes and the Second Vatican Council articulating that, yes, there is a sense in which if you are in a cognitively ideal position, you are obliged to become a member of the church, and to knowingly and deliberately reject it would imperil your salvation. But that is not directed to people who are not in this cognitively ideal situation. God will take account of the various other factors they're dealing with. And so if they otherwise are trying to live good lives and respond to God's grace and so forth, even implicitly, even if they don't consciously believe in God, God will take all that into account. It's only knowing deliberate rejection of divinely revealed truth that imperils salvation. If someone's trying to do the best they can and through no fault of their own, they haven't arrived at the fullness of truth, then God is going to take that into account, and he can still give them his grace anyway. So if you want to read more about that, you want to look at the Vatican II document Lumen Gentium, and specifically you want to look around it's several paragraphs, but like around paragraph 16, where they talk about these different principles, and they're consistent with what happened previously in church history. You would just see, as you go back and look at the historical sources, you see these different kind of tides of opinion being affected by social situations and what theologians are aware of. Like, are there lots of non-Christians who we're aware of that have not heard the gospel or are trying to strive to follow God, like as Greek philosophers, or, people who've never heard, like Native Americans and so forth?
Thanks for your insight. I think John will be satisfied with that. He got every possible angle that he could have wanted on that one. Majesty of Reason asks, much love from Indiana. How much leeway?
Love to Indiana.
How much leeway? Whereabouts are you? Are you in the US? Sorry. California.
I'm in California, so I'm on the West Coast.
How much leeway is there in Catholicism's model of God? That would be his biggest barrier. He's was raised as a Catholic, I think, so it's like his biggest kind of life option, I think. I have many problems with simplicity, timelessness, etc. So classical theism. So
the answer is there's probably more flexibility than is commonly understood. Although the church does teach divine simplicity and divine timelessness and so forth, those can be understood in more than one way. And oftentimes what you hear is a Thomistic presentation of these matters. And although and the church does not specifically sign off on Thomism, so there are other articulations of divine simplicity or divine timelessness that have not been prohibited by the church. In fact, one of the things you find when you study the history of magisterial actions, including church councils, is that they usually avoid trying to settle matters that are under dispute by theologians. They're principally concerned with things that they regard as new attacks on the substance of the faith. But if you have, like, the Franciscans are saying that, and the Dominicans are saying this, and the Augustinians are saying that, well, they've been discussing that for a long time. We're not trying to settle those issues. And so in teaching that God is timeless, the magisterium is not meaning to endorse one exclusive understanding of what timelessness would mean. It would allow a legitimate diversity of opinion, such as that found in the various Catholic theological schools up to that point, and it wouldn't preclude future understandings of timelessness. So when you're, and this is a principle that's true generally when reading magisterial documents, you have to read them very carefully, because they're trying to do something very narrow. And so I don't know if this term is used in England, but or in Britain, but in American legal courts, there's what's known as a strict interpretation, which means kind of or in various contexts, it can kind of mean a sort of minimal interpretation. We're trying to guarantee the minimal content. It's just this bare fact. It doesn't deal with all of the potential ramifications or ways of understanding the bare fact. We are saying this bare fact is true, but then how that's understood and elaborated is something there can be discussion about. So I would say Majesty of Reason, by the way, like your channel, I would say that in considering all this, be aware that the church is not simply signing off on Thomism or any other one understanding of these things. And typically there is significant flexibility about what options, can work with this teaching.
Would something like an open theism, that's saying like God doesn't know the future, would that be too far, or within Catholicism? Or
I think that from a Catholic point of view, yeah, I think God does know the future, or because, I'm speaking more for me here. I mean, I think the church would agree that God definitely knows things about the future. Exactly how he knows them is something that can be theologically elaborated. And I would have my own theories that would indicate God has a robust understanding of the future. There are limits, though, conceptually, to omniscience. For example, and this is it's essentially the same limit that applies to omnipotence. Omnipotence isn't the ability to do anything you can say. It's the ability to do anything that can be done in terms of logical possibility. Well, in the same way, omniscience doesn't mean knowing anything you can say. It means knowing anything that logically can be known. So, like, God does not know the shape of four-sided triangles, because that's a logical impossibility. There may be other things, and this is sometimes like, it's an option that I propose when people ask, well, why would God create people knowing they're going to go to hell? That would imply that God has a kind of counterfactual knowledge that I don't think is a given. To me, so in order to say, I'm not going to create John Smith, because if I create John Smith, he will choose to go to hell. That would require God to know the outcome of John Smith's free will choices when he never made any free will choices. And the thing about free will choices is they are not determined in advance. And so to me, knowing the outcome of a genuinely free will choice that is never made sounds like shape of a four-sided square. It sounds like a logical contradiction. And so I'm open to the idea God doesn't know. He doesn't have what William Lane Craig would call middle knowledge, and other people have called middle knowledge. He doesn't know the outcome of free will decisions that are never made. And so God has to take a chance and say, I'm going to create John Smith, and then he's got free will and can use it however he chooses.
Thanks for that. Jonathan asks, I'd be curious to hear Jimmy talk about God's necessity. He recalls you saying that metaphysical possibility means not implying contradictions. I mean, firstly, is that right, I guess? And then, do you think that God's existence is logically necessary?
I think something is metaphysically possible as if and only if it does not contain a logical contradiction. And so that goes along with my understanding of omnipotence, which is the classical one. Do I think God's existence is logically necessary? I think so, but once again, to quote Newman, I have difficulty explaining how in figure and mood. But so I've, based on our discussion today, I've proposed that I think there must be an ultimate explanation that exists. And the alternative would be to say, well, what if nothing existed, including God? I find the concept of total non-existence incomprehensible. And so I have a strong inclination to say, no, something must exist. And minimally, that would be God as the ultimate explanation. And then anything else that the ultimate explanation results in also would exist. But I think the idea of total non-existence of anything is incoherent logically. So I think God's existence is logically necessary, or the ultimate explanation's existence is logically necessary.
That's interesting. That might be another place where, if we were to talk further, we might differ, because I think I tend to think that logical possibility is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for metaphysical possibility. And maybe it's some of the more kind of like Thomistic ways of thinking about things, because the things I was thinking of that maybe I'd appeal to would be like water being H2O and things like that. And I'd say like it's logically possible, for example. Sorry, I'd say I'd think that people could know what water is, right, without knowing that it's H2O. But when we talk about like things like water having to be H2O is like metaphysically possible. But it being, why did I say it'd be a necessary condition for it to be logically? Maybe I didn't mean that. But I think what I'm saying is I think there's difference between them, because I think it's metaphysically necessary that water is H2O, like the thing. But there's not like a contradiction in saying it in not saying that or something.
I think there is, because I think if you dig deep enough into the definition, so logical contradiction means there's a contradiction in the terms. There's something about the meaning of the terms that contradicts something else. And I think if you dig down into the meaning of water, it's going to turn out to involve H2O, and therefore it would be a logical contradiction to say water can be something other than H2O.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's because it's a posteriori or something. Maybe that's why I think about it differently. I understood what I said it the wrong way. What I meant is logical possibility is sufficient for being metaphysically possible, but it's not. It's not
necessary, but not sufficient for metaphysical possibility.
Yeah. That's what I meant. It's sufficient, but not necessary. Sorry, that's what I meant. So if something's logically possible, then it is metaphysically possible. But if something's metaphysically possible, it's not necessarily logically possible. That's how I meant to. So you think that there are things that are metaphysically possible that do involve logical contradictions? Oh yeah. What am I saying? I don't know. My brain's not working at this point. I'll think about it more. It's late in the day for you. It's still fairly early morning. Now it's mid-morning for me. Yeah, that is definitely not what I think when you put it back to me. So yeah. Anyway, but fascinating. Happy to discuss that in the future if you want. But yeah, we could differ on something like that, and that could drive the way that we think about God's existence and stuff. Okay. Pine Creek says, it's just this way is unsatisfying. So are you unsatisfied with the explanation of God's nature? I think that's in response to what we were saying earlier. Well, so sure, I would love to know more about God, but I have limited knowledge. Just like I would love to know more about various aspects of quantum physics that haven't yet been determined. But I don't currently
I'm satisfied with the current understanding of God's nature that I have. Not as satisfied as I would be if I had an even greater understanding, just like I'm currently satisfied with my knowledge of quantum mechanics, even though I would love to know more about quantum mechanics, including things that we can't currently determine scientifically. So I'll have to, I expect when I get to heaven, God willing, that he'll share more of the good stuff. He'll reveal more about himself to me, and I will be even more satisfied than I am now. But are there questions I would love to know more about that I find it unsatisfying? I don't. Well, sure, but I'm satisfied enough. So it's going to depend on how you're defining satisfied.
I think the fire alarm's going off in my background. So it's feet cooking. Oh, no. It's fine.
Okay.
So sorry about the noise. I'll sort that out in a second. I think I was right, by the way. I'll sort that out if you want.
Yeah, go ahead. Take a break. So I'll continue to just talk here until Nathan's able to get back. Pine Creek, nice to meet you. I am aware of you. I haven't had a chance to watch a lot of your channel yet, but I look forward to doing so. I've had a mental note on my to-do list, and so I also familiar with Majesty of Reason's channel, and I appreciate the discussions philosophically that Nathan and you and Pine Creek and others are engaging in, and happy to participate.
I was just going to say, I processed the question that you asked, and I think it was an accurate description of what I was trying to say. Yeah, that logical possibility is sufficient for metaphysical possibility, but not necessary. So I think, meaning, in response to your question, yes, I think there are things that are metaphysically possible, but
that are not logically possible.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe, no,
cool.
Do I think
so? Like. So yeah, the more, maybe. To my mind, the more intuitive position to take would be to say, well, logical possibility is a necessary condition for metaphysical possibility, but it is not a sufficient condition for metaphysical possibility. So that's why, like Bill Craig would say, well, he didn't like my articulation of this because he thinks that within the set of logically possible things, not all of them can be actualized by God. So he would concede that a universe with an infinite history is logically possible, but he doesn't think God can actualize it. So he doesn't think that a universe with an infinite history is metaphysically possible.
Yeah. Maybe, but I think, as I think about it more, I'm like, no, why am I thinking of it that way? So I need to think about it more. It's that if and I definitely do have a problem with the if and only if, though, but I'm trying to think of what's motivating that. I think it's because it seems to me that the naturalist doesn't have to provide like a logical contradiction to reject like a modal ontological argument. That's what is. Whereas if the two were the same, then you'd have to be like, well, what's the contradiction, right, in saying that God exists, and it would. So I'd have to think about that more, because I think it's metaphysically possible, right, for God. That I think someone can say it's metaphysically necessary that God doesn't exist without having to provide a logical contradiction. But maybe I need to think about that more. Okay, Oscar asks, does Aiken think God just analogically makes choices?
Well, so I think that there is a reality of free will that God has, and that he exercises. Now, there is, I'm expressing all this in human terms because I'm a human and that's the only way I have to articulate this matter. So I recognize there may be an element of anthropomorphism or analogy in my articulation of this, but I think that there is something in God that corresponds to freedom in a real libertarian sense. It it may be different than human freedom, but I think it's real, and human freedom is the best model I have to think about it. So that's what I use. What I would not be open to is some kind of super Calvinistic expialidocious understanding of God, where God just has no freedom and everything he does is mathematically determined by his own essence.
Okay. Gareed Dassine asks, God exists versus materialism isn't a dichotomy. Stoicism accepts both, for example. And I guess Mormons as well. I think I could be wrong about that. I can't. I think this is
they have
a
kind of subtle matter view to explain spirits. Mm-hmm.
I think this question was probably at a specific point in the conversation. If you can recall what.
Well, yeah, it could have been applied to a number of different points in the conversation. That's why I alluded to William James and his live versus dead hypotheses. There are ways of combining God exists with materialism, but that involves it's going to be like you're on Futurama and you go to the edge of the universe and there's a big machine that's God or something. God is going to have to be a material entity if in order to combine those hypotheses, and that's an option that is dead in the universe of discourse that I think Nathan and I were exploring, where it's kind of one or the other. I mean, what we're really on to discuss is there a non-material God that's ontologically real? So when I say God exists, that's what I mean. But I recognize there's bunches of other conceptual options.
Real Atheology asks, what do you think the church is doing to address the concerns of more sophisticated / philosophically informed atheists? It seems a lot of Catholic apologetics is mostly geared towards Protestants or new atheists.
So first of all, great to see you, Atheology. I think that what is the church doing can mean different things. The church, if you understand that to mean like, what is the magisterium doing? What is the Vatican doing? It is encouraging a broad-based re-engagement with culture and people of other perspectives. The way that gets cashed out, though, and that's part of an effort that's known as the New Evangelization, but in terms of how that gets cashed out on the concrete level, it's sort of organic. You will have people who engage in dialogue on a sort of as needed basis with different groups. For a long time here in America, the principal source of conflict regarding Catholicism was not atheism, but conservative Protestantism. And so when I got started in the field 30 years ago, that's, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and it was fundamentalist Protestants who were the squeaky wheels. So lots of apologetic effort got thrown in that direction. With the rise of the new atheism, that became a squeaky wheel, and you started having people engaging more with that. But there are people, including Catholic philosophers, who are interested in engaging with more philosophically sophisticated atheists and skeptics of other stripes. And I think that I would expect more engagement to grow in that area as well, in part because we're able to talk to each other and be nice in ways that hasn't been the case. But, and hang on just a second, because I keep getting notifications here. I'm going to do not disturb. Okay. There we go. I don't know if you could hear those bells going off.
No, I couldn't.
Good, yeah. But they were distracting to me. I was getting text from my sister. But in any event, I would expect more engagement of this in the future as we have the internet has begun to provide ways that we can conveniently talk to each other. And I would expect that to continue through blogging and YouTube discussions and papers being written in journals.
Pine Creek asks, Jimmy, is there anything wrong in believing in a false God?
Yeah, it's false.
There we go. Very concise. Edgar Acure, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says non-parsimonious models may tend to overfit data and lose predictive power. Wouldn't you consider parsimony to be like a good explanatory virtue on this ground?
Well, yes, but it's got to be balanced by counter parsimony of making sure that the explanation is complex enough to provide robust predictive power. Because if you make it too simple, you're going to lose predictive power too. Really, what we're trying to do is find the best fit. And that's neither intrinsically simple nor intrinsically complex. So I think it's a balancing act. And we shouldn't just propose parsimony as if that was the only concern. I mean, technically, it does have the needed to explain the data qualifier built into it, but people tend to lose sight of that and just think, go with the simple.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I don't know if you've read, Gregory Dawes has a book on theism and explanation. And he talks about, he talks about a lot of like what it taken. So he's an atheist himself, but he actually addresses a lot of objections to proposed theistic explanations and talks about why there are like problems with them. And then he talks about, Swinburne's, and it'll come to Thinburn for some reason, Swinburne's argument for God's existence,
it's an upper class pronunciation of Swinburne. Swinburne.
Yeah, it's me like lisping on my words or whatever. So yeah, that's a really good book, I think, if people are interested in those sorts of questions, because I think he does, he does kind of probe like, well, why should we consider parsimony an explanation? How should we balance it off against these other things? Should we consider things like testability or prediction to be virtues in explanations? Why should we think that? And
what was his name again?
Gregory Dawes.
Okay, I'd like to look up that book. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's a good. It is a really good book. I liked it a lot. Because one of the things he talks about as well is, I think there's some quote from an atheist philosopher who says something like, isn't there just a silver bullet to put an end to all the nonsense or something, in terms of, like a lot of people have thought, well, maybe we can just do away with theistic explanations by, just saying, well, they're not contrastive, for example, because whatever happens, is what you say, God kind of did. And if something, it doesn't tell you why that happened rather than something else. And he's like, well, here's a bunch of problems with that kind of, like response that someone might give. It doesn't, and I think it's a really fair and good look at explanation and the kind of like virtues that we should have in them in good explanations. Jamie asks, can I become a Catholic and keep Saturday Sabbath?
Well, Saturday is the Sabbath. The church acknowledges that. It's not a day on which Christians are required to worship, because it's a ritual requirement that was given to the Jewish people before the time of Christ. So they were obliged to observe the Sabbath, which is Saturday. Christians celebrate the Lord's Day, the day of the Lord's resurrection, and we thereby fulfill the same underlying moral principle of let's devote adequate time to rest and to the corporate worship of God. So the same moral principles are being cashed out on a different day on the calendar. In terms of if you want to go to Mass on Saturday to fulfill your Sunday obligation, you can do that. If you go to Mass on Saturday evening, it will count for your Sunday obligation. So absolutely, you want to do Saturday Mass, you can do that.
Just a couple more questions, just so people know in the chat, by the way, not to, if I don't get around to yours, sorry. Ray Cosby asks, has Jimmy considered if philosophy has a high failure rate when considering it as a tool to examine Catholicism or any variety of Christianity? So I suppose in like, I'm not sure if the question is saying in an apologetic context, or if it means like studying philosophy leads to more problems than it's worth or something for the average Christian. I think of philosophy as a form of critical reasoning, and so as such, it's a tool. Philosophical analysis is a tool that can be used to consider many different subjects, and it will have different degrees of utility depending on the subject. For example, philosophy is
speaking historically, philosophical analysis, which tends to be rather a priori, is not as good as a posteriori analysis for investigating natural phenomena. Like, that's why we have chemistry as a different discipline than philosophy these days. But there are still aspects of chemistry that philosophy can be illuminative for. And so I think it has utility, but it's a limited utility in engaging with chemistry or physics or law or any other subject. And I think the same thing is true of religious faiths. It has a limited utility as a form of critical thinking, especially a priori critical or largely a priori critical thinking. But it does have limits that and will result in misapplications if extended beyond those limits, like trying to use philosophy to deduce the Trinity, I would say is a misapplication of philosophy.
And then the last question, Ethan of Spartan Theology asks, how does Jimmy respond to Christians like Barth and Bonhoeffer who reject natural theology? Can someone be a Catholic and reject natural theology in a similar way?
I think it's going to depend on how you understand natural theology. What the Catholic Church teaches is that it is possible, and doesn't say easy, doesn't say for everybody, but that it is possible to deduce the existence of God by natural reason. And so that's a church teaching. It's actually, I'd have to check to see what's its level of authority. It may or may not be on the level of infallible, but simply saying that it's hypothetically possible, or it's possible, but not necessarily for everybody, to deduce the existence of God by natural reason is a fairly small part of natural theology. Natural theology generally wants to go beyond that and address a lot more. And on those additional areas, the church doesn't have a teaching. So I think it's going to depend on how expansive an idea of natural theology one has. In terms of how I would respond to people who reject natural theology, well, if they mean that St. Paul is wrong when he says that certain things about God can be known by looking at the world, then I'm going to side with St. Paul. So I think Scripture teaches that certain things can be known about God by looking at the world. That doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's going to be obvious to everyone. It doesn't mean that you don't have to make certain presuppositions to interpret the data of the world correctly. So it's actually I think the claim is somewhat more modest than people might suspect. But if you say Paul's just flat wrong about this, well, I'd say, okay, I'm going to side with the Bible on this one. I think there's some sense in which this must be true. If you want to argue it's a minimal sense, well, I'm open to hearing that argument. But if to utterly reject any and all forms of natural theology, I think would be a mistake.
Okay, so I guess finally, where can people go to see more of your things? Is there something coming up that you want to promote for people? A particular episode or something?
Oh, let's see. Well, okay, so I work for Catholic Answers, and our website is Catholic.com because we thought ahead.
Yeah, there you go.
And so they can find out more about apologetics there, including stuff I do. I've got various books that are on Amazon, whether the British or the US version. Our main radio show and podcast at Catholic Answers is called Catholic Answers Live, and I'm typically on at least every Thursday. And I take questions on just about any topic, and people are welcome to call from anywhere in the world. So you can check out our schedule. That's at Catholic.com. We also have a YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/CatholicCom. And if they want to find out specifically more about me, they can go to my website, jimmyakin.com. all you have to do is spell my name correctly. Jimmy, and then Aiken is just 4 letters. It is so easy. AKIN. No E's, T's, S's, nothing like that. Just Aiken, exactly like it sounds. So jimmyaiken.com. And they can also check out podcasts. Like I said, other podcasts that I do on the side, like Secrets of Star Trek, Secrets of Doctor Who, and the best known is Jimmy Aiken's Mysterious World. We've got around 100,000 listeners per episode. We're consistently in the top 20 to 25 documentary podcasts in America on Apple Podcasts every week. We investigate all kinds of interesting mysteries, whether they're scientific, historical, occasionally true crime. Try that, Oscar, and see how well that goes for you. And paranormal and supernatural ones. So lots of fun stuff to think about, and check it out. And you can do that among other places at just type in Jimmy Aiken's Mysterious World, or go to youtube.com/Jimmy Aiken, where I have my YouTube channel, and like and subscribe while you're there.
I don't know why I'm finding the chat doing this so funny. Jimmy Bacon, Jimmy.
Oh, I had, you wouldn't believe what I had to grow up with. Hey, Aiken, I hear McDonald's making bacon, no faking. I loathed that ad campaign.
Okay, so I guess going forward from today, like I'm happy as well. Mm-hmm. Like if you want to have a conversation at some point in future, maybe we could like narrow it down to something more specific to talk about. Like I'm open to that. I'm not saying it has to happen or anything, but I mean I'd like to read the PhD dissertation that you talked about on psi phenomena. I think that'd be interesting, regardless of whether or not anything comes from it. And
I'll send you a link because it's available online.
Right. And then just, happy to talk about things in future, I guess. Any closing remarks you want to make about our conversation for people?
No, I think it was a productive conversation. I think, I have a better understanding of the shape of your thought, and I hope I was able to offer some things for fruitful reflection. Obviously I know we're coming from different places, certainly at this point, so that's to be expected, but I feel we were able to have a cordial, positive dialogue, and I appreciated it very much and would be happy to discuss things in the future.
Cool. Well, thanks for that. I feel similarly. Thank you, everyone in the chat, for watching. And also, I'll put links for Jimmy's stuff in the description box after this. And if you want to support me, you can do so, obviously, by subscribing to the channel. And also, I have a Patreon. So there's a video on there that I just made about Pascal's Wager, which patrons have early access to. So if you want to get my thoughts on Pascal's Wager, I guess I don't really share much about what I think about it, more about different ways that people can think about it. But that there's an hour-long, more lecture-style video with slides and things there if people are interested. So the link for that is in the description. Other than that, thank you, everyone.
And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. I'm trying to grow my channel, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless you.